The Fate of Austria. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 826 New Deutschland. Archduke Franz, please forgive me. The princes won't care about this land unless they pay for it, and even if they care, they don't have enough sea power. What Franz wanted them to guard against was naturally not enemies at sea, but possible wars on land. Don't worry, didn't we also transfer 20% of the profits to them? Just 20%? Metternich was a little curious that Archduke Franz had always been a very generous or prodigal man. Why did he think that 20% of the profits this time could buy off the entire German Confederation? But even if a war breaks out one day, it will be after his death. With the current development speed of the Austrian Empire, if it continues for a few decades, maybe those small states will naturally join in and there will be no need for their help. In defense said, don't worry, I guarantee that there will be a reason they can't refuse when the time comes. Franz also realized his problem. After all, Metternich didn't know that the world's largest gold mine was buried under the Transvaal. He could only continue to use the old method of deception. This sounds much more pleasant indeed, and 10 million florins per year is not a huge financial pressure on Austria. What made Metternich unhappy was that, even though the Austrian Empire had paid for the land, he couldn't use it. Just like how we treat black people, we should directly expel all black tribes in sight, and at most only allow black workers to enter. In fact, most of Austria's colonies in Africa are facing the problem of labor shortage. Due to racial issues, white people are actually not suitable to work in places where the sun is too strong. They are easily sunburned, and the tropical climate is also unsuitable for them. Accepted. Most of the initial construction of colonies involved simple manual labor, but why was it possible to do this in West Africa? But why did Franz violently expel it in East Africa? First, East Africa already has the simplest basic towns, and it is not starting from scratch. Second, there are a considerable number of Dutch descendants in the local area. Third, the West African region came into contact with colonists earlier, and the country has a higher level of development. It already has a basic kingdom, and is easy to communicate with. The tribal countries in East Africa are relatively primitive. Although the locals are mainly Bantu people, there are more than 300 languages in subdivisions. There is almost no common language, or the existence of a leading party who can be proficient in all language families relatively speaking. Although there are many countries in West Africa, each region has a common language, and there are a large number of leading parties, and there are not many people who can speak Spanish and Dutch. These two languages were not a problem for the Austrians, especially the nobles who almost all learned these two languages. Fourth, there are many great powers in West Africa and they are close to Europe, so Franz did not dare to go too far. Relatively speaking, East Africa is much better, especially since there is a scapegoat in the Oman Empire, so Franz can naturally be more arrogant closer to home. Metternich and Franz each took a step back to decide the fate of the Boers. They were lucky to have escaped expulsion from the British, but not so lucky because their country was not recognized, but not so unlucky because they would no longer be alone. They would become Germans. The historical evaluation of this negotiation by later Transvaal historians Andres Pretorius returned home in honor because the British side would send warships to escort him back as a show of sincerity. Also heading to the Transvaal were a German Confederate fleet and some German Confederate aid personnel. In fact, 90% of the so-called German Confederate fleet are Austrian warships, and the rest are used by other countries as window dressing. As for the so-called helpers, they are of all kinds, including missionaries, teachers, carpenters, blacksmiths, and even doctors and soldiers. But one thing they all have in common is that they are all nationalists. In fact, this was proposed by Prince Metternich, and Franz said he wanted cultural transformation. Metternich immediately thought of the domestic nationalists. For so many years, Austria and Prussia had been playing international police in the German Confederation To deal with nationalism. Austrian German nationalists demanded the expulsion of all foreign nationalities, including Magyars and Italians. Prussian nationalists not only wanted to expel the Poles, but also the foreign royal family of the Hohenzollern family, as well as the East Prussians. In addition, Franz has been supporting the Archbishop of Cologne, who has lived up to expectations and established the unity of politics and religion. At this time, Prussia was a tripartite country with 100 flowers blooming and thousands of rivals vying for success. The Swiss region that Prussia has just swallowed does not have much influence yet, and it is a place where French people live. And with Prince Shotgun personally in charge, there is no chaos yet. All in all, both Prussia and Austria have captured a large number of radical nationalists, and other small states are no exception. These people are very difficult to deal with and cannot be killed or released. As a result, prisons in various countries were overcrowded, and an early industrial chain was formed in Prussian prisons at this time. Prince Metternich proposed this to solve the urgent needs of various princes, and Franz also very much agreed with this approach. The Transvaal can be said to be the best place for them to go, and this group of people don't have to worry about being reversely assimilated. In fact, the most important thing is that most of these people are talented people, and having attended middle school in Prussia may not be a big deal. But in most remote areas of Austria, people who have attended high school and local families will compete for these talents and even want to offer them up. And many of these nationalists in prison have real higher education, and many of them have university degrees. Some are soldiers who have experienced hundreds of battles, soldiers who have even studied systematically in military schools, and some top craftsmen who have been abroad. At that time, it was difficult for ordinary people to have access to this kind of thing. Those who had access to these ideas were relatively avant-garde people. Instead of locking them in prison and wasting their youth and food, it would be better to let them go to Africa to shine. Moreover, Franz also had another consideration, which was to send them far away so as not to be released again in 1848 to cause trouble. To Franz, it was simply killing multiple birds with one stone. And this was the case for most of the German princes. As a result, the penal colony for German nationalists appeared. Of course, the princes would not say so on the surface. The monarchs still wanted to save face. That's why there was the New Germany Assistance Plan, and the German Confederation changed the name of the Transvaal and Orange colonies to New Germany. However, not all princes were happy, such as the Luxembourg Parliament, which themselves were German nationalists in power. They had been deeply benefited by nationalism before, but this time their speaker Kerda Jr. was ordered to go home and reflect due to his gaffe at the German Confederation meeting. Chapter 827. William II's ambition. Although the punishment was not severe, little Kerda's attitude was very serious. He would thank guests behind closed doors when he returned home, which made the whole of Luxembourg very nervous. The Cordier family had a lofty status in Luxembourg at this time. After all, the glory of Luxembourg at this time was due to the old Cordier's huge gamble on the German Confederation. It was also very painful for the Luxembourgers to leave their homeland and go to Africa. However, seeing that other countries sent so many people, they could only send some volunteers there. In addition to the Luxembourgers, the Dutch were not too happy, at least not their King Wilhelm I. In fact, he was really excited when he heard that old Pretorius said that the Boers were not Germans. William II felt that the Boers might want to recognize their ancestors, which was similar to the Great Dutchism he advocated. In fact, William II also advocated that the Dutch were not Germans. Although they were part of the German Confederation, this did not mean that the Dutch had to be Germans, and the Dutch themselves are no longer the immortal little strongmen who resisted Spain. The 80 Years' War, which lasted for 80 years and fought hard against France. The Franco-Dutch War, after the Dutch fought a series of arduous wars, they did not see the light of day. Instead, the elites packed up and ran away. Britain's glorious revolution. William of Holland came to rule Britain. Although many history books say that William was nothing more than a mascot, the Bank of England established with his support has left a profound mark on the entire history of capitalism, and is also one of the important reasons why Britain can truly take off. Now in the history compiled by the Anglo-Saxons, the Bank of England is the world's first central bank. But in fact the Bank of Amsterdam in the Netherlands was earlier. Now I only mention how the clever capitalists defeated the conservative and stupid old aristocracy of England, but there is no mention of William or the final decision of King William III to issue the charter, let alone the principle of the Bank of England. Borrowed from the Netherlands with the transfer of capital, shipbuilding, manufacturing, and even the service industry also moved to the UK. After that, the UK naturally became the world's financial center and the world's hegemon. Capital has no borders, technology has no borders, and knowledge has no borders. The elite can treason, but ordinary people in the Netherlands are not even qualified to treason. In the end, they only got a piece of chicken feathers, their economy plummeted, and later they were destroyed by France. The French army also carried forward their fine traditions and committed all kinds of evil. After the Napoleonic Wars, merchant King William I began a series of reforms, and the economy finally recovered. As a result, the British asked Leopold I to break the soil on the Dutch land and make him king. William I's reforms failed, the ZTE was interrupted, and the Dutch economy once again ushered in a great recession. Later, it was joining the German Confederation that made the Netherlands, which had been lying flat, sit up again. Therefore, it does not matter to ordinary people whether they are Dutch or not. What is important is that they can live a good life. Then why don't the Dutch engage in French nationalism or British nationalism? It's because of the language barrier. The cost for people at the bottom to learn a foreign language is very high, and German is at most a dialect, but at the very least the language logic is the same. A Dutch person might feel familiar with German, but never with Spanish, even though they were ruled by the Spaniards for centuries. Therefore, the Netherlands is very puzzled, and even disgusted with the behavior of King William II. Wilhelm II was equally puzzled, and felt instead that his people had betrayed him. He was very excited when he heard that Dutch descendants did not consider themselves Boers. However, reality soon gave William II a heavy blow. Old Pretorius did not consider himself Dutch either. This directly frustrated William II's plan to monopolize the Transvaal. In his logic, he believed that, although the German Confederation bought the Transvaal, the people living there were Dutch. So the Netherlands should take over the Transvaal, and he should be king of the Transvaal. However, the German Confederation obviously only regarded it as a penal colony. Criminals in prisons in various countries would be sent to the Transvaal, and it was also called help. William II felt that the German Confederation was too hypocritical, but at this time it was more advantageous for the Netherlands to side with the German Confederation than to side with France and Britain, because the benefits were visible. Moreover, the Netherlands has also received a share of the benefits in Switzerland. If it chooses to withdraw from the German Confederation at this time, the Swiss enclave will naturally cease to exist. William II felt that he should find an opportunity to punish the domestic nationalists, and the Dutch nationalists could no longer tolerate their king. It only took a spark to ignite the anger between the two parties. Spain. The clouds of war once again loomed over the country, and Carolists who had been trained in England entered Spain from Portugal. The French were also unwilling to let the fat in their mouths fly away. Almost at the same time, the French Foreign Legion entered Spain from the Pyrenees border. It was uncomfortable for Queen Regent Christiana to be attacked from both sides, but there was nothing she could do. Neither Britain nor France could compete with Spain at this time. In the end, the Orthodox faction, headed by Queen Regent Christiana, chose to lie down, huddle all their forces near the capital, and then sit back and watch the British and French fight on their own land. At this time, Austria and the German Confederation were still busy digesting Switzerland. Post-war reconstruction was the top priority. If it didn't work well, it would be better to just vacate the cage and replace the bird. So the states were particularly concerned. The people of Alga did not have any objection to returning to the Habsburg family. After all, they had been tortured by Frijoles before. After losing 10% of the population, 30% of the houses, and almost all the pastures, there will naturally be no memories of the Swiss Confederation of the past. Thanks to the tyranny of Frijoles, the obstacles were cleared for Franz. As long as he is no worse than before, he can win the hearts of the people. At the same time, the old bureaucrats and local gentry defected from the Orthodox alliance to join the Free Alliance before the war. Their actions were also considered by the locals to be the source of the disaster after all. Surrendering without firing a shot always makes people feel a little unconvinced. The old bureaucracy and the local squires' misjudgments before the war and their incompetence during the tyranny of Frei Holosei left them with a tarnished reputation and no longer able to win over the people. But this actually saved their lives. Because Alga was an enclave after all, and Franz didn't want these people to get bigger, let alone accept someone who could challenge the authority of the empire. But now that there was a group of street rats that everyone was shouting to beat, Franz didn't need to be too serious. Franz only needs to make them admit their mistakes, then firmly nail them to the pillar of shame, and then use the gesture of a great country to win people's hearts. Chapter 828. Another disaster year. The Swiss Civil War has just ended. The Spanish Civil War is about to begin. The Russians are in constant civil strife, and several forces in the north are ready to move. In summer, heavy rains come as expected. Central Europe is a vast country, and floods in North Germany have broken out of rivers and wreaked havoc in cities and countryside. Countless lands have been submerged, houses have been washed away, and people have been displaced. Prussia, Berlin. Floods flooded the streets, and the rudimentary water circulation system collapsed, causing countless filth to overflow. After the floods receded, cholera broke out again. In addition to Prussia, Bavaria, and Saxony were not spared. The German region has a well-developed water system, so canal construction is an economical and practical business. However, excessive development quickly destroyed the structure of the original water network system. Coupled with the advancement of science and technology, human beings' ability to develop land has been greatly enhanced. Many lakes and swamps originally used to store water have been drained and used as farmland, further destroying the original ecology and risk resistance capabilities. The result was a major collapse when heavy rains came and floods rushed out of the rivers, flooding dozens of towns in North Germany, destroying many buildings and displacing people. But the most terrifying thing is that the floods have also destroyed the farmland, and there is no way to harvest any more planting at this time. Today is destined to be a barren year. In addition, major disasters must be followed by major epidemics. After floods enter the city, they will bring out the filth in the rivers and urban drainage systems, coupled with the difficulty of cleaning up the animals and plants that died in the floods. The result was epidemics of epidemics, especially cholera, a terrible disease that made a comeback. Floods and epidemics have made people no longer optimistic, and everyone has begun to hoard food and necessary daily necessities. As a result, prices have skyrocketed, and the poor have become poorer and the rich have become richer. There is an old saying that goes, after a great disaster, there will be a great epidemic, and after a great epidemic, there will be a great famine. Floods, plagues, famines, disharmony among people, and great chaos also appear, but relatively speaking, things are much better here in Austria. The Danube, the largest river in Europe except the Volga, has a larger runoff than other rivers in the German Confederation. The probability of disasters in history is more frequent and more terrible. However, the raging river water was firmly locked in the river channel, and the dikes that were prone to collapse in the past became unbreakable immediately after the magistrates moved in. The high-ranking officials who were usually accustomed to serving pork chops, red wine, and beauties around the fire at home were all wearing ponchos and patrolling the river embankment. Note: Austria is a country that is accustomed to eating pork. Even today, its pork consumption ranks first in Europe. The reforms carried out by Franz and the establishment of large-scale pig farms in the book are also one of the objective factors. Because the price of pork has dropped, more people will eat it. Many urban residents who haven't received much rainfall don't even feel anything. They still go to work and eat on time, but there are fewer luxury carriages on the streets in the eyes of ordinary people. The owners of those luxury carriages must have taken the opportunity to skip work and go home to sleep in. They could only say, "It's nice to have power." Ordinary officials who were also freezing and pouring on the river embankment couldn't help but be very touched when they saw that their bosses, who usually idle around, push around, and have no responsibility, were actually freezing with them. They even felt that they had wrongly blamed the other party. What a role model for us. Fart. The workers on the side couldn't stand it anymore and cursed. His wife, children, and property are all down there. How can he not be interested in it? Without floods, Some farmers who are accustomed to fleeing famine in big cities would be embarrassed. A village woman asked, "My dear, the dam has not burst. Should we run away?" The villagers on the side fell into deep thought. Escape from floods has been a tradition in their village for many years. However, in the past few years, there has been a sudden lack of floods. Escape to Vienna would be embarrassing and would be regarded as a liar. This way, you and the children go first. The ticket is not much anyway. Remember to bring 2 sets of clothes and read the newspaper more often. If there is news about floods, you can beg on the spot. If there is no flood, then you can take the children and stay safe. Travel around Vienna and gain insights. My wife was also very embarrassed. She used to go hungry, wear ragged clothes, and beg frequently without feeling anything. But life has improved over the years, and I can fill my stomach by farming. My clothes are clean, and I suddenly feel a little unable to kneel down. What about you, dear? Someone has to be at home to watch. What if it doesn't rain in 2 days? If the water in the ground is not cleaned up in time, it will be over. I'm at home, you go. The wife nodded and took the children to pack their bags and prepare to go to the train station. At this time, the husband stopped his eldest son, who was already as tall as himself. "What are you going to do?" "My mother and I went to Vienna to beg." The young man was a little stunned, not quite sure what his father meant. "You are not allowed to go. You and I stay at home and guard the fields." "Why? You are the eldest son. How can the future head of the family beg for alms from others? All your elementary school education was in vain." Spain. The heavy rain did not dampen the enthusiasm of both sides in the Civil War. The Carolists, Orthodox, British, and French fought together, and the bodies were buried underground mixed with mud. The plants on this land will be even more luxuriant next spring, and decades or hundreds of years later they will become the collections of history buffs. Rome, Vatican. A trial was about to begin, in which Pius IX would be present in person. He was very excited, because these 2 prisoners were sent by the Austrian Empire. Pius IX felt that this was a sign of goodwill from the Austrians, and believed that it would not be long before they returned to the arms of the Lord and paid back the debts. Tithes they owed. What kind of prisoner could give Pius IX such a big illusion? They are the former president of the Swiss Confederation, Joseph Loy, and the generalissimo of the North, Freddy Hollos. Their war atrocities in Switzerland are well known to the world. In addition, these 2 men also persecuted Catholics in Switzerland to a heinous level. Later, they ransacked monasteries, used priests as laborers, and sent nuns as military prostitutes, which made His Majesty the Pope want to have him alive. But what angered Pius IX the most was the persecution of the Jesuits by these 2 men, and the death of the invincible Minophil, which almost uprooted the power of the Papal State from Switzerland. The efforts were in vain. As the ever victorious general of the Papal State, and one of the few close friends of Pius IX, Minophil's death was a great blow to the Pope. When the news of Bishop Minophil's defeat and death reached the Vatican, the Pope's eyes widened, and he shouted, "Impossible! Impossible! Absolutely impossible." But the facts were right in front of him, and he couldn't help but not believe it. So Pius IX found the chief exorcist of the Papal State. He firmly believed that the Swiss used demonic magic to defeat the just bishop. At first, the exorcist thought that the Pope was asking him to replace Bishop Minophil in the war, and was still thinking about how to deal with it. When the Pope said this, the exorcist suddenly felt confident. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 829. Mercury seals the coffin. Saint Michael the Archangel God. Protecting me is like an enemy. Help me and wait to defeat the evil schemes of the devil. Pray to God. The fate demon retreats far away. Your great God, commander of the heavenly host. With the main divine power, Bring Satan and his parade around the world. A demon that harms human souls, drive them all into hell. Amen. Excerpt from the Book of Exorcism. Vatican City, St. Peter's Square. Residents of Rome, ambassadors from various countries, senior leaders of the papal state, 48 cardinals in red robes, and even His Majesty the Pope will attend in person. The identity of the exorcist in the papal states has always been very mysterious, especially the chief exorcist who only listens to the call of the Pope himself. It is said that he has been leading his disciples outside the territory to fight against the 7,459,26 evil spirits in hell. Some people say that together with mysterious organizations from all over the world, they are guarding a seal related to the fate of mankind. Some even say that this exorcist has lived for more than 10,000 years and has witnessed mountains rising from the ocean. Under the scorching sun, a pale-skinned man wearing a black robe accompanied the Pope onto the high platform. His hair was grey, but his face was firm, and there was no trace of hesitation in his movements, making it impossible to judge his age. There is no doubt that the man standing next to the Pope is the legendary chief exorcist. The cardinals all stood up. Holy hymns resound through the sky. Pius IX raised his scepter, and the whole place was immediately silent. He solemnly announced, "Our brother, the beloved Bishop Maneful, has left us, but instead of ascending to heaven, his soul was taken away by the devil." The whole place immediately erupted in exclamations, and people began to whisper. After all, the theory of ghosts and gods has existed since ancient times, but it is rare for it to come from the mouth of a big man like the Pope. Quiet. We know you feel angry, scared, and helpless, but the Lord will bless you. No evil spirit can harm you in this holy city. Amid lengthy leadership speech, we have caught the two devils who started the Swiss Civil War. The crimes they committed are too numerous to describe. A whole box of files was brought up. Every volume, every page, every word here is an indictment of them. Pius IX picked up a volume at random, opened it and read aloud. On February 17, 1847, Joseph Loy ordered the arrest of all Catholic monks in the canton of Fribourg and the seizure of all monasteries. Pius IX picked up another volume. On March 21, 1847, Freddy Holosa ordered the village of Interla that refused to pay taxes to be burned down. All the men were killed, and the women were sent to the labor force. He actually didn't even spare an 80-year-old lady. Every time Pius IX said this, the audience would exclaim. He felt that the fire was enough, so he raised his scepter. Several strong priests escorted two men with black hoods onto the high platform, and then removed their hoods. The two men immediately struggled, as if they were afraid of the scorching sun. They are Joseph Loy and Freddy Holosa, the initiators of everything. The audience immediately let out earth-shattering shouts, including fear, anger, and excitement. At this time, the man in black robe spoke, his voice hoarse like the friction of rusty gears. This is not their real name, and they are not the initiator of everything. There is someone else who is the real Black Hand. Hearing this, the British ambassador couldn't help but swallow his saliva. At this time, he only listened to the chief exorcist continue to preach. Their real names are actually Ani and Rudra, the two demons under Satan. The crowd in the audience once again exclaimed, "It's really the devil." No wonder they are afraid of the Sunday. Then some people began to pray silently, and the British ambassador breathed a sigh of relief, as if he was surviving the disaster. Although Joseph Loy and Freddy Holosa were prisoners at this time, they were once heroes after all, and one of the important causes of the Swiss Civil War was religion. So they immediately started talking back and forth. "Why do you call us devils? Are you going to nail us to a cross and roast us?" In fact, the tactic of hunting witches and crucifixion was done by Protestants in order to plunder the wealth of those widows and carry out primitive accumulation of capital. The Holy See does not recognize the existence of witches at all, but the exorcists are obviously experienced and will not get entangled in meaningless matters. He directly took out the cross and raised it in his hand and shouted, "Look directly at me, Joseph." Loy and Freddy Holosa could not open their eyes when facing the chief exorcist holding a cross. This was what the people around saw with their own eyes, and they couldn't help but believe that the cross really had the effect of exorcising demons. And those two men who could not look directly at the cross must have been caught by the light of the Lord. In fact, they guessed half of it right. It was indeed, because of the light. The chief exorcist had his back to the sun, while Joseph Loy and Free Holosa were facing the sun and the cross, and, in order to make the effect better, the priests, at the instruction of the chief exorcist, locked the two people in a small dark room 36 hours in advance, deprived them of water and food, and wore black hoods on the way there. One way to do this is to make the prisoners have no energy to shout, and the other is to prevent their eyes from adapting to the strong light at this moment. Of course, this is not a smart approach, nor is it a long-term solution, so the chief exorcist decided to cut the knot quickly. Bring me the holy water. The deacon on the side carefully held the aspirosorium, a tool for spreading holy water. The chief exorcist took the aspirosorium and poured the holy water on Joseph Loy and Free. On a low side point only a scream was heard, and the skin on the two people's faces was visibly necrotic, with traces of white gas coming out. This time it was the cardinal's turn to scream, and the deacon was so frightened that he rolled over. They are afraid of holy water, and will reveal their true colors when exposed to it, which is in line with people's stereotypes, so the crowd in the audience immediately shouted, "Burn them! Burn them!" Joseph Loy and Free Holosa wanted to defend themselves, but they had no strength, and the pain prevented them from speaking out sounds other than howling. Seeing this scene, Pius IX felt angry and surprised at the same time. He was angry that he actually encountered a demon who killed his general, but he was happy that he had such strange people under him. It seemed that he must be the one chosen by God. "What do we do?" "Burn them," Pius IX asked in a low voice, and the chief exorcist answered respectfully, "No, Lord Pope, they are the incarnation of evil spirits. They are not afraid of ordinary fire or swords. Even if they are killed, they will possess other people." The Pope was horrified and asked, "So, what do we do?" "There is only one way, and that is to put them in a crystal coffin, add mercury to seal it, and place them underground in the holy city under guard day and night. Only in this way can we prevent them from causing trouble in the world again." But, as a result, with thousands of Roman residents watching, the two demons were sealed into mercury coffins. Chapter 830. The Wind Rises. Paris, France. A farmer from Pomerania was frowning. He felt that he could not understand the world more and more. On the one hand, there was Archduke Karol, who had achieved brilliant results, and on the other hand, Austria was unwilling to send troops. All this was extremely unreasonable. You must know that a lion fights a rabbit with all its strength. The Habsburg family must have a conspiracy to place such an important figure as Archduke Karol in Switzerland. But the reality is that Austria did not take away many things, only the so-called ancestral land of Algo and an eagle castle that was in ruins. Algo is not a small country in Switzerland, but for the beast of the Austrian Empire, it can only be regarded as a candy at best. Is it necessary to take such a big risk for a small candy? Obviously impossible. As for the current rumors that there is a large amount of gold buried under the Eagle Fort, it is even more nonsense. After all, if it has been poached by the Swiss for so many years, how can it be kept? Moreover, before the Habsburg family became prosperous and became the emperor of the Shinra, it was just a small and unknown family. Coupled with the high price of gold in the past, it would be good to have a few hundred gold coins, but Bismarck is Bismarck after all. Since we cannot seek the fundamentals from the perspective of interests, we should start from the victims. He soon discovered a problem, that is, the Prussian had already pressed against the French's throat, or it would be more appropriate to say it was the arsehole, but the latter was not very civilized, so it was better to use the throat as a comparison point. Neuchâtel was not a big deal in the Swiss Confederation before. But now the Swiss Confederation is no longer there, replaced by the German Confederation. The threats from the two are naturally different. At this time, Prussia was like an arrow from the German Confederation, hitting the narrow throat of the French. What's even more terrible is that the French have occupied two Swiss cantons near Neuchâtel. Once the two sides go to war, Prussia will definitely be involved in the war as a pawn. Coupled with the Rhineland in the north, the French had almost no reason not to attack Prussia first. This is really a bad move, but the master is that he can survive the checkmate game. Bismarck was this kind of person, and he quickly found a flaw in it. That is, Prussia could use these two Prussian royal territories to win the support of France, which might have a miraculous effect against Austria. Only in this way can we escape the fate of becoming an outpost of the German Confederation, but I don't know if there will be such a king with such courage. Bismarck couldn't help but sigh. It would be nice to have a fool emperor who doesn't care about anything. At this time, the waiter in the restaurant came over and said politely, "The total is 1 franc and 5 sous. Bismarck took out 1 franc and 6 sous and handed it to the waiter. "The rest is a tip for you. No need to ask for it. Thank you." Note: 1 franc equals 20 sous equals 100 centimes. "Thank you, sir. You are such a good man." The waiter left happily with the tip, but Bismarck felt a subtle change, because Parisians are very proud, and even a waiter or coolie will look down on foreigners. But at this time, the waiter in this high-end restaurant actually thanked him for the tip, which was very unusual. Moreover, robberies and thefts often occurred near the hotel where he stayed. It seemed that it was becoming increasingly difficult for the French to earn money. Bismarck picked up his hat and put it on his head and was about to leave. At this time, he saw 2 bearded men, one tall and one short, one blonde and one black and brown, walking in. Both sides could tell at a glance that each other was German. After both parties were briefly stunned, it was Bismarck who broke the silence first and took off his hat. "Hello, compatriots. But whether you are here to see the world or to try your luck, I hope you leave here as soon as possible." "Why?" the tall blonde handsome guy asked with some confusion. "It's going to rain. We are just here to wait for the rainbow after the rain. Based on my years of experience, there may not necessarily be a rainbow after the rain, but there may also be a plague." The handsome blonde boy scratched his head a little. "In recent years, Prussia has been like this. When it rains, filth flows across the city. Then came the widespread influenza and plague, which caused the workers in his factory to work hard for a year and finally gave them all to the doctor. Some people even lost their lives in order to save money." He could not understand all this until he met the man of his life's best friend. "How would you know if you don't look?" the relatively short black-haired man on the side said. "Of course, the shortness is only compared to the 2 tall men next to him. In this era when the average height per person is less than 1.7 meters, 1.8 meters is still very tall. Unfortunately, the 2 people next to him are tall. Me-jius, and they are all soldiers. Then, I can only wish you good luck. But if you want to see bigger storms, I suggest you go to Vienna. Paris is the center of Europe. It is now, but soon it won't be. And the winds are often not strongest in the center of the storm, but on the side." How to say, humanism originated in Italy, and Joseph II was the most radical person of that era, but the real storm destroyed France. Now times have changed. The 2 sides passed each other. Bismarck returned to Prussia, and the 2 bearded men were ready to accept the most advanced ideas in Paris and witness the beginning of the storm together. Spain. The Civil War was in full swing, and both sides showed no intention of retreating. Even typhoons, heavy rains, flash floods, and volcanic eruptions could not stop the Civil War, which suddenly came to an abrupt end. The British economy collapsed, and the cause was actually the spoils brought back by Palmerston's negotiations. Palmerston was not a mediocre person. After 2 rounds of shopping in the German Confederation, he came up with information that the intelligence agencies had not been able to find out for several years. The price of food in the German Confederation was much lower than that in Britain, and through the special relationship of the British royal family, he could open up smuggling channels. So Palmerston decided to exchange all the expected money in his hands into grain. Transport it to Hanover first, then transport it back to England from Hanover, and then sell it after arriving in England. Earn the difference. This batch of grain was sold at a low price in the London market. As a result, London's grain merchants finally couldn't bear it anymore. Because grain merchants maintain high grain prices by borrowing money, and grain from Austria and Ireland comes regularly. So they could deal with it in advance, and the loot Palmerston brought back from the German Confederation was obviously not in their plan. However, in order to sell the stolen goods as quickly as possible, Palmerston kept the price of grain very low, which forced grain merchants to eat this batch of grain immediately. As a result, the capital chain was broken. At the same time, Financiers who saw the situation was not good have withdrawn their capital and asked grain merchants to pay off their debts. The latter had no choice but to sell grain. The result was that grain prices plummeted and more grain merchants went bankrupt, and then the scale became larger and larger. Finally, many grain merchants became insolvent, causing financiers to go bankrupt. After being unable to recover their costs, then the bigger banks and the bigger financiers asked the bankrupt people to repay their debts, so the bankrupt people started selling their bonds. Chapter 831 Economic Crisis of 1847. Investors began to cash out in large quantities. Faced with the run, bankers tried to protect themselves and also began to sell low-quality assets. The result was a stock market collapse. Among them, railway stocks, which were once popular, were regarded by many as inferior assets and became the target of selling because their income fell short of expectations. A break in the capital chain is fatal to any industry, so a large number of railway projects have been suspended and countless workers have lost their jobs. These unemployed workers flocked to the cities in large numbers hoping to find a job, but in this economic winter it was the same everywhere. All walks of life were in recession, and a large number of factories closed down, which led to the resurgence of Chartism. Older child workers such as David, Jim and Kit also joined the protest march. These workers who came out of the mines were the most militant. Because they fight against death every day and have experience of long-term strikes. The most critical thing is that the price of British coal has increased, but miners' wages have dropped to 1/3 of their original value. The contract had become a scrap of paper, and the John Russell government chose to turn a blind eye to the miners' complaints. After all, in his opinion, these guys are just unworthy people who can be solved by just ignoring them or using a little intimidation. At this time, John Russell had to solve big troubles. Bankers' interests were suffering losses. Factory owners could not sell the goods they produced, and some officials were assassinated and kidnapped. His first move was to stop so-called free trade, especially heavy taxes on Austrian grain and goods. At the same time, we cracked down on smuggling trade and require that pellets are not allowed to enter the country. Franz was already prepared for this. Previously, the Ottoman Sultan Mejid failed to donate money to Ireland and instead sent food. Now Franz felt that he could do the same. After all, instead of paying high tariffs to help the British solve the crisis, it would be better to send it directly to the Irish people in urgent need of food. However, Franz still underestimated the lower limit of the British. He only knew that the Ottoman Sultan Mejid's donation of £10,000 to Ireland was rejected. The British reason was that Queen Victoria only donated £2,000 and the Sultan could not donate more than the Queen, so he could only donate £1,000. Afterwards, Mejid sent several more shipments of wheat, and the result is that Drogheda United's team emblem is still the Star and Moon symbol. Drogheda United is one of the strongest teams in the Irish Premier League. Ireland is very conservative in terms of religion. Historically, it once banned divorce among its citizens despite the pressure from the entire West. It was not until 1996 that a bill allowing divorce was passed. However, the review was strict and the cost was outrageous. But what Franz didn't know was that Majid's delivery of food was rejected 3 times. Finally, the Ottoman sailors broke through the British blockade on a dark and stormy night before delivering the food to Drogheda, Irish port. The Austrian fleet does not have this time, and the British will not turn a blind eye to the Austrian ships. After all, the Ottomans are allies of the British, and they have no ability to threaten the British. But Austria is different. If they break in and are discovered, they may be sunk by the British on the spot. It is completely unnecessary to take such a big risk for the nationals of other countries. If the Austrians were saved, the captains might risk their lives to try, but the Irish or the British have nothing to do with them. It's necessary. At the same time, Franz's rescue plan basically failed. Merchant ships could no longer make profits and basically would not go there again. Only a few church ships and passenger ships were left that were willing to help. The result is a significant reduction in capacity and the inability to carry Ireland around the world as originally planned. The former is better to have some work. After all, it is better than no work, but the latter is very troublesome. The Irish and Italians like to huddle together for warmth. If the group cannot assimilate or conflict with the local Austrian immigrants, or even attract the covetousness of the British, it will be a big trouble. But at this time Franz received an unexpected helper, an Arab businessman. I'm afraid that only the British can get the Arabs to help their religious enemies. This reminded Franz of the scene when the terrorists who were beaten to death and the government troops guarded the Tabqa Dam together. The gene of doing business seems to be engraved in their bones. If the Ottoman Empire had not declined at this time, I'm afraid that their footprints would have been all over the world. But at this time, with the rise of the Oman Empire in West Asia, especially after its marriage to the Austrian Empire, the Arab merchants who had been dormant for hundreds of years became active again. But just doing business with Austria cannot satisfy them. These Arab businessmen hope to fly the Austrian flag and do business around the world. For this reason, they were willing to help Franz solve this little trouble and were willing to hand over 10% of the profits to the Austrian Empire. However, the corresponding Austrian Empire should protect their security and interests and help them explore new markets. The reason why Arab businessmen were willing to do this was because they had no choice but to do so. Because the British did not give them a chance at all. The so-called free trade was to turn them into colonial compradors. In contrast, Austria's penetration into other countries is much worse. At least it does not show a strong desire for control. And under the propaganda of Oman, said the great and Indian merchant Vera Wise, France and the Austrian Empire were definitely the most trustworthy trading partners in the world. Of course, Arab businessmen must also make some small moves. After all, white slaves are still in high demand in the Arab world. But compared to millions of people starving to death, this price is nothing. Franz also has preventive and countermeasures, which are generally harmless. They can also eliminate some cancers that are difficult to control and can also catch some people. The most important thing is that Franz really doesn't have much energy to pay attention to things on the island of Ireland at this time. He has done almost all he can do, and the rest can only be left to their own good. Since the Austrian Empire only partially joined the German Confederation, it could not avoid the impact of the German Confederation nor the impact of the domestic market. In addition, Franz also has to face the consequences of the superdoubling of nationalism that he has contributed to. In addition to restricting imports, the British also hope to expand exports. John Russell hoped to get the United States to lower tariffs to facilitate British dumping of domestic goods. Although this idea is naive, the British Empire really has many cards in its hands. John Russell expressed his willingness to redraw the border with the United States, which led to a split among the ruling groups within the United States. Although there were shadows of northern factory owners behind Polk, the desire for land throughout the United States was too strong. Moreover, Polk's own campaign slogan was "Use the 54 degrees 40-minute north latitude as the boundary line, or else there will be war." The slogan inspired voters and made Polk proud. Polk admired Andrew Jackson very much and hoped that he would open up new territories for the United States like him. He also liked others to call him Little Walnut. Note: Andrew Jackson was called Old Hickory to describe his tough style. Chapter 832, Economic Crisis of 1847. Historically, the US-Mexico War was started by Polk, but it was obviously unrealistic to use troops against Mexico at this time. Expanding the border to the north is also unwise, but that is another matter if it can be resolved through negotiation. If land could be gained for the United States at the expense of some people's interests, Polk was more than willing to do so. As a result, the British and American senior officials hit it off immediately, and the two sides began to exchange interests. The United States allowed British goods to enter the American market, and the British colonies recognized the United States' sphere of influence. The factory owners in the north were wailing, while the plantation owners in the south were already buying up. But people in this world who betray their own class interests usually don't end well, and Polk is no exception. Mr. President was ambushed by gunmen on a small road. Mr. Polk, who was strong, pulled out his pistol and fought back. During the pursuit, he was hit in the back of the head by a bullet from an unknown source and fell to the ground. Vice President Dallas took office temporarily As a well-known trade protectionist, he abolished the trade agreement signed by Polk and the British as soon as he came to power, but when it came to changing their faces, the British did not give in. They immediately tore up the border agreement between the two countries and sent troops to expel the Americans and American troops. These two agreements, which were quickly signed and then abrogated, became the famous two pieces of waste paper in the mouth of later historians. In addition to external affairs, the British also have internal measures, which are to limit the decline in grain prices and ensure the interests of grain merchants through official pricing. Food is not something you can wait to buy like other commodities. People need to eat if they want to live. Although the grain merchants were saved, people had no money for other consumption. As a result, this economic winter has been extremely cold, and all walks of life have been affected. The number of factories closing down in 1 month is equivalent to that in the past year at this time. The British government's bailout policy also included using government debt to purchase large amounts of grain to ensure the rapid return of grain merchants' funds. As for the debt owed by the government, it is naturally left to the wisdom of future generations. If all the money is used to bail out the market, then the Spanish Civil War will naturally not be fought. However, their opponents, the French, were not much better. French Jewish bankers lent money to the British government in order to earn high profits. As a result, France, which should have benefited, also fell into financial difficulties. The elite soldiers and generals of the Foreign Legion could not work without military pay and even helped. Because soldiers of the French Foreign Legion were owed military pay, they began to slack off in the war and even carried out gang robberies, which turned the Spanish Orthodox rear upside down. Although the Spaniards no longer have the generosity of their ancestors, they have the pride of never bowing down. The Spanish people began to spontaneously organize guerrillas to fight against the French Foreign Legion. Not to mention the French army without military pay at this time. Even the undefeated division led by Napoleon could not conquer Spain. Soon the Foreign Legion was on the verge of collapse due to the inability to pay troops and excessive casualties. At this time, Louis Philippe had to withdraw the army to prevent the situation from deteriorating further. Successive years of poor harvests have caused French agriculture to collapse, and prices for almost all crops have increased fivefold. In fact, the French did not make no efforts. They bought a large amount of grain from Russia in the hope of alleviating the domestic food crisis, but the reality is that the German region next door is flooded, while they themselves are plunged into drought. Due to drought, the water level of the Rhone River dropped, making the river impassable for large ships, and the French railway had not yet been completed. The grain purchased from Russia could only stay in Marseille. Note: Marseille is a port in southern France with convenient water transportation. In fact, this railway was contracted by Franz's leather company. He only purchased the construction rights through bribery and other means, but did not start construction. This was not all, because Franz wanted to take advantage of the French. In fact, Franz felt that he was completely overly worried. Because most of the railway lines in France have not started construction, Franz did not start construction either, in order to be less unconventional. In addition to the collapse of agriculture in France, the industry is not doing much better. The great development in the past few years has caused factory owners to increase investment. But Louis Philippe and Giza jointly ignited the war in the colonies. Heavy taxes greatly reduced the purchasing power of the colonies and even caused widespread uprisings. Texas, once a model colony, had become the least secure area among the French colonies, and violent tax resistance was common. In order to suppress the uprising in the colonies, the French invested much more than they gained in taxes. The most critical thing is that almost all of France's colonies are in rebellion, and there is a strong rebel force in each place, so France has to devote all its energy to fighting. The previous boom in textiles also benefited from trade with the East, but in order to solve their own economic crisis, the British decided to monopolize India in the Far East. The British began to squeeze out French businessmen. The gap in Eastern influence between the two sides was too large, and the French were defeated without any suspense. At the same time, because Franz opened up the Japanese trade route, a large amount of cheap Japanese raw silk began to pour into the European market, which was another fatal blow to France. At this time, only Lyon in France and the Venetian region of Austria produced raw silk on the European continent. So France could make huge profits every year due to all the above. The profits of France's textile industry have plummeted, and due to excessive investment in the past, which has led to overproduction, coupled with the reduction in sales, factories have to resort to large-scale layoffs and shutdowns to protect themselves. The result is that a large number of workers are unemployed, giving rise to a large number of beggars and jobless vagrants. France's coal and iron industry has also begun to shrink. Because of the previous wave of railway construction, investors have poured into the steel and coal industries hoping to get a share of the pie. However, the imagined wave of railway construction did not appear. Many projects have not been launched yet. There is no market for steel, and the demand for coal is naturally not that strong. Eventually, the entire business community collectively looked down on the steel and coal industries. In 1847, France's pig iron production fell by 21.8%, wrought iron production fell by 27.7%, and coal production fell by 22.4%. The most exaggerated thing is steel production, which was almost cut in half in 1 year. Louis Philippe's series of operations, such as lending money to the Russians to purchase Alaska, transporting souvenirs from Egypt, etc., coupled with France's own natural and man-made disasters, and the intensification of colonial conflicts at this time, the Orleans dynasty's deficit rate was as high as 45%, up to 630 million francs. Historically, the deficit rate of the Orleans dynasty has remained above 25% all year round. However, in the book, France is more radical and richer, so the deficit rate is higher. In fact, before 1843, the Bank of France still had reserves of up to 1 billion francs. That was the peak of the French, but with the expansion of the ruling class of Louis Philippe and the Orleans dynasty, a large number of wars and construction caused gold to disappear like running water. At this time, there were only less than 30 million francs in gold reserves in the French treasury. But at the very moment, when Louis Philippe needed his bankers most, French financiers chose England. My family member is hospitalized, and I'm here to take care of him. Chapter 833 Spread. The United Kingdom and France have experienced thunderstorms one after another, and the United States and Germany are also uncomfortable. After all, Britain and France are the largest customers of American raw materials. The reduction in imports from the two countries has directly led to the decline in the prices of American cotton, grain and other raw materials. The German region was influenced by British and French financial capital. German Jewish bankers invested a large amount of money in Britain and France, which directly led to the shutdown of industry in the German region. In fact, the German region also suffered a disaster, but because Austria is in this system, life in other countries is pretty good. Coupled with the previous victory in Switzerland, the people and the government were intoxicated with a short-term victory. However, all this came to an abrupt end after the collective betrayal of financiers. This behavior caught all countries by surprise. In fact, it is not entirely correct to call it betrayal. It should be called profit-seeking. But whether it is betrayal or profit-seeking, the German countries have no money in their hands, let alone borrowing money. As a result, a large number of projects have been put on hold, and there is no money for disaster relief. The hungry and displaced people cannot feel the power of the country. These refugees wandered along the railway lines, causing trouble in the city, and soon the prisons in various states were filled with prisoners. Soon the news spread that people could eat well in prisons, and a large number of poor people who could not afford to eat even began to commit crimes openly in the hope of being caught and imprisoned. Overcrowding in prisons has worried various governments. At first, they thought these people wanted to go to prison because they were lazy, so the government began to let the prisoners participate in labor. As a result, this group of people not only worked hard without complaint, but also had a very high technical level. They were able to complete the work well every time. Even some of the thorny prisoners became good citizens under the inspiration of collectivism. This makes the governments of various states even more troubled. Because of the economic crisis, nothing is profitable. Workers are unemployed in large numbers. Good people cannot find jobs, and there are not so many jobs for prisoners to do. At a high-level government meeting of a certain country, someone suddenly came up with an idea. Is it possible to send these criminals and refugees to the colonies? This can not only find jobs for them, but also reduce the burden at home and create value. How can we have a colony? It's true that we don't have colonies, but the German Confederation does. Yes. Transvaal. The senior officials suddenly became excited. They thought they had come up with a way to get the best of both worlds. However, someone soon poured cold water on them. Isn't it free to pay for the boat ticket? Isn't it free to eat and drink on the way? A senior executive immediately sneered. Point indeed. One person's expenses along the way from Germany to the Transvaal, New Germany, were enough to relieve several disaster victims. If they have so much money, wouldn't it be a good idea to just give them government relief? On the other side, Prussia. King Frederick William IV was also helpless. The domestic food harvest was failing, and prices were soaring, but he could do nothing. This is not because Prussian officials are incompetent, nor is the king not wise enough. In fact, Prussia can solve the current crisis as long as it imports food from Russia. At this time, many people living on the border had begun to purchase grain from Russia. However, doing so not only violated the treaty of the German Customs Union, but also caused losses to the domestic junker landowners. William IV himself was the largest junker landowner in Prussia, so he faced a very fatal problem at this time point. That is to save the people, or save himself. If he ordered to purchase a large amount of grain from Russia, not only might he be impeached by powerful countries such as Saxony and Bavaria, but he would also directly anger the domestic junker nobles and those merchants who hoarded grain. The previous example of the murder of US President Polk is still vivid in our minds. Although William IV was the king, he was helplessly surrounded by powerful enemies outside and traitors inside who were causing chaos in the country. He could only think of other ways. In fact, the main reason why Austria could purchase grain from Russia unscrupulously was due to the opposition of Prussia and Hungary to joining the German Customs Union. This gave Franz almost unlimited room for maneuver. He could use the name of the St. Stephen's Crown territory to purchase various goods from Russia. As long as the Russians can sell their own things, let alone Austria, Hungary, and even their mortal enemy the Ottoman Empire. It doesn't matter historically, the Ottoman Empire has been the largest exporter of Russian grain for a long time, because the former refused to introduce Russian grain, and the two sides even fought a war. In fact, in addition to the Jewish financiers in Prussia, the native factory owners in Prussia also had some small fortunes. Especially in recent years, Prussian factory owners had received a lot of government subsidies. William IV felt that he should be able to borrow money. As a result, in addition to aristocratic factory owners such as Krupp and Siemens who were willing to subscribe for national debt, more factory owners chose to unite and negotiate with the king. First, they demand a higher discount rate, which means more returns. For a 200 million thaler bond, they were only willing to pay 170 million thaler, and directly made a net profit of 30 million thaler, which is equivalent to the cut-off interest of private small loans. At the same time, they also demanded that the Prussian government implement a representative system, expand elections, and reduce the power of the king and nobles. Finally, it would be best to have another constitution. William IV felt that there was no need to continue the discussion. As long as he was not crazy, he would not be able to agree to these outrageous demands. It is impossible for the monarch of any country in the world to agree to such conditions, as long as there is still a glimmer of hope. If people don't eat something like food for a day, they will go hungry. Over time, rebellion will inevitably occur, if they can still afford weapons by then. However, William IV did not want to sit still and wait for death. He also had the mission of the Hohenzollern family to revitalize Prussia and unify Germany. Just when William IV was at a loss, the returning finance minister Friedrich thought of another good idea. Your Majesty, don't the Austrians always advertise that their country is tolerant and has a vast territory and abundant resources? That's right. The damn Austrians often offer high salaries to our country's outstanding scholars and engineers. They are maliciously competing. William IV was very sensitive to this, because the Austrian side often used the banner of the German Confederation to scout for various talents throughout the Confederation. However, as the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in history, Austria has never stopped poaching from other countries. Serving the emperor is a tradition among the people of various countries in the imperial era, and it is an honor. However, various countries also have countermeasures, which is to use generous material rewards to retain talents. To put it simply, they include high-ranking officials, generous salaries, beautiful cars and beautiful women. However, now the Austrian side has changed its tactics. In addition to the glory and tradition it has always promoted, it now also adds generous rewards, and even starts to talk about dreams. Chicken soup. As a time traveler from a later generation, who drank chicken soup every day until fried, it was not difficult to write a few chicken soup articles, to trick people in the 19th century into pursuing poetry and distance, as well as the wealth and status that matched themselves. Chapter 834, Substitution of Flowers and Trees. Don't panic when facing a deep canyon. Don't flinch. How will you know you are an eagle if you don't jump down? Oriental version. How do you know if there is a magical secret treasure waiting for you under the cliff without jumping? In fact, the Austrian Empire is still a blue ocean at this time. As long as you have the ability, or are willing to endure hardships, even if you just rely on a ruthless energy, you can make a career, as long as you don't hit the muzzle of Franz's gunpoint. In fact, the most important thing is that Austria is very wealthy at this time, and other countries cannot compete with it financially, so they criticize it verbally and writtenly. However, the reality is that Franz's routines and Austria's preferential policies are more likely to attract the so-called elites, and their ideas and beliefs are more important to civilians. Therefore, although the number of German immigrants attracted by Austria has experienced explosive growth many times over the years, the overall scale is still not very large. Back to business. Friedrich List listened patiently to William IV's complaints and curses. In fact, he understood the choices of those people very well. Because if we only compare the prosperity, Berlin is probably not comparable to Vienna, even the suburbs of Prague. If he had to choose again, he might not leave Austria and flee to the United States. In fact, Austria's development over the years has exceeded his imagination. Note, Prague, the capital of Bohemia, was the most important transportation, trade, and industrial center in the northern part of the Austrian Empire at this time. It not only benefited from the dividends brought by the German customs union, but was also the place most severely affected by nationalism. As a fervent nationalist, Friedrich List felt that Austria was the country most likely to lead Germany. However, when he wanted to eliminate this possibility with his own hands, he still hesitated for 0.00001 seconds. Your Majesty, as far as I know there are no special restrictions on immigration in the Austrian Empire. What do you mean? William IV was afraid of people saying this, because the last officer of the Ministry of Internal Affairs who said this had immigrated to Austria, and brought an entire special service team with him. We can send all those troublemakers and criminals to Austria, so that we can survive the crisis, and also consume Austria's national power. If the Austrians accept it, then they will have to bear the crisis for us. If they do not accept it, then the lies of the Austrians about immigration policy and the big Germans will be broken. Moreover, those unscrupulous people and criminals are not economical people in the first place. They will definitely commit crimes when they arrive in Austria, and their lives will not be satisfactory. If there is a war between the two countries in the future, these people will be our help and cooperate with us inside and outside Austria. William IV was so surprised that he couldn't help but admire him. Wonderful. Wonderful. So wonderful. 4. Prussia, its biggest enemy has always been Austria, so this strategy of passing Prussia's pain on to Austria was particularly pleasing to the ears of William IV. This is also a good idea for Prussia's top leaders. After all, if Prussia wants to maintain its influence and even ensure that it will not be weakened into a small country like Saxony, they must be wary of Austria. However, Foreign Minister Karl von Kaunitz, the one who had participated in the Vienna conference, was hesitant. Then, Your Majesty, if we transport immigrants to Austria like this, we will definitely be discovered. What if the Austrians want to retaliate against us by leading these wars? The Austrians gained an extremely high reputation both within the German Confederation and the German Zollverein. Coupled with the remaining power of the old era, if they want to sanction us, I'm afraid that no country will stand on our side, said War Minister Hermann von Point angrily. Under the leadership of Frederick the Great, our Prussian alliance with Austria, France, and Russia were all defeated. Are we still afraid of the Austrians bringing a bunch of bastards with them? The words of the Minister of War were very angry and powerful, but they were too outrageous, so they were ignored by everyone. Times have changed, and at this time Prussia and the German Confederation were fighting. Even if there was no need to fight this war, Prussia would have internal chaos. What Karl von Kaunitz said makes sense. Although Austria has not used the power in its hands, no country will doubt that it has this power at this time. It was Friedrich List who stood up. Please rest assured, I believe that all German countries have the same problem at this time. We can first let Mecklenburg and Anhalt, which are good friends with us, do it. I believe that, as long as someone does this, other countries will definitely follow. When we in Prussia implement our plan, the Austrians will have no reason to doubt us. Even if we knew it was us, without evidence, we could only break the teeth and swallow the blood. Prussia's top leaders approved Friedrich's proposal after some calculations, but just in case, they still named the plan Friedrich Plan. As a result, an overwhelming army of immigrants was sent into Austria along railway lines and rivers, directly overloading the Austrian immigration office. German immigrants were a good thing for Franz. Even if the number was abnormal, he didn't care at all, because Austria had as much land as he boasted. There is none in the country, and there are colonies. Even if all the people in Germany immigrate to Austria at this time, France can still eat it. However, entry review must still be carried out strictly, because this can minimize the social unrest that may be caused. But in order to ensure efficiency and give a good impression to those who were new to Austria, Franz decided to temporarily double the staff and mobilize some young nobles and college students to help. Regarding the distribution of immigrants, it is still the same as before. Those who can enter factories can go to factories, and those who are able-bodied can enter the army and government agencies. Those with special skills can be treated specially, but they need to be assessed and help them find corresponding jobs according to their abilities. Anyone with a high school education or above, and who voluntarily serve the empire, can apply for the position of support teacher. The probation period is 5 years. Those with excellent grades can enter the Imperial government and become grassroots officials. In addition, you can also choose to go to St. Stephen's Crown Territory, Vojvodina, West Bosnia and other places to open up wasteland and farm. The worst option is to go to the colonies, but the specific work in the colonies depends on the arrangements of local officials, and a series of relevant agreements need to be signed. Because sometimes Austrian laws do not fully apply in the colonies. However, going to the colony would allow the family to directly receive a compensation of 500 florins, and if they unfortunately died in the line of duty, they would also receive an additional compensation of 500 florins. This is very attractive to ordinary people, especially Germans outside the Austrian Empire, who may not be able to earn this kind of money in their lifetime. Chapter 835. A populous country. In fact, France's immigration policy was very attractive, at least several times better than the immigration policies of other countries, but unfortunately the people's attitude towards the colonies did not change. Most people still think of other continents as savage lands, but that's only if people can get by. At this time, when they don't have enough to eat and even go to jail, many people don't pay so much attention. In order to get a settlement fund for their family, or to get a good bride price or dowry for their brothers and sisters, they are willing to risk their lives to an unknown continent. As a result, a large number of Germans began to go abroad and traveled to various parts of the world along with the merchant ships of the Austrian colonies. Many people have written suicide notes before leaving, but soon they will find that things are not as bad as they thought, but in a sense more terrible than they imagined. However, most of the immigrants attracted by the Austrian Empire this time were sent to the Crown Territory of St. Stephen. After all, there was plenty of land, and it was fertile enough to support a large population. And Franz also feels that there are enough people to be safe. After all, as the area most affected by storm years in history, Hungary will inevitably cause a bloody storm. He did not want the precious German immigrants to be buried in a bloody storm, but they had to endure the test, because only in this way could they be beaten into real Austrians. The number of workers among this group of German immigrants was very large, because industry outside the Austrian Empire was affected by this financial crisis due to the existence of a central bank, Austria has been less affected. At least there will not be such an outrageous situation as the capital chain is broken. Secondly, more than 50% of Austria's factories are in the hands of the royal family, that is, France, and the production capacity of these factories accounts for more than 90% of Austria's production capacity. Most factories rely on technological innovation to maintain their competitiveness. However, because of this, Austria's demand for cheap labor is not great, so France can only make them construction workers to prepare for future expansion of production capacity and produce some durable goods. As strategic reserves, working conditions in Austria are actually much better than in other German states because there is a lot of rest time. During the break time, there will be a special pastor or preacher to give lectures to them, and they need to learn German, history, common sense, and loyalty and patriotism courses, and even take exams in addition. Selecting and classifying immigrants is also a technical job. Honest people with families are classified into one category, and the elderly and skilled workers are classified into the second category. The third category is young single women and children under 16 years old, and the fourth category is men who are alone and have no skills. This is actually a distinction between risk levels. Honest people with a family have the most things to consider, and they are also the most peaceful, so they are easier to manage. Relatively speaking, the elderly and skilled workers also long for a stable life, and they can endure, even if they encounter some injustices. The former have only a short time, while the latter have the skills and feel that they will be successful sooner or later. Single women and children themselves do not have much ability to resist, but their ability to cause trouble is not bad at all, so they are classified into the third category. The most dangerous ones are men who are alone and without any practical skills. They need to be sent to the army or less important factories first, and their behavior should be restrained by discipline and collectivism. Secondly, Catholics are safer than Protestants. This is not because France has any prejudice. It was the 30 years of religious war that caused the entire Holy Roman Empire to lose half of its adult males and more than 30% of its population. The conflict between the two sides was not so easy to resolve. Although the Austrian Empire declared freedom of belief at this time, more than 90% of the citizens believed in Catholicism. Many of the nobles in the local area and the army have been passed down for hundreds of years. Their ancestors were killed by Protestants, and not everyone can give up their hatred, especially when they are strong and the enemy is weak. Therefore, France acquiesced to some actions of the church and the government. The church naturally preached and reformed, showing the goodwill, strength of the Austrian church, and at the same time presenting facts and reasoning, telling immigrants the benefits of doing so. If they still stay in their original place, they may not change their ideas easily, but now that they are out of their familiar environment, human nature is to seek advantages and avoid disadvantages, and they can easily change under coercion and inducement. The government requires immigrants to register their religion. In fact, this is to facilitate management. They want to ensure that the proportion of Protestants in any community does not exceed 20%, so that it is not easy to create opposition. As for the extra population, they can be sent to the colonies. After all, there are more powerful foreign enemies there, and they will have no time to fight. Soon a report was placed on Franz's desk. It was an estimate of the immigrant population in 1847. The number of immigrants absorbed in the whole year of 1847 may exceed 2.4 million, which is equivalent to the total of the previous 6 years. Since Franz's statistical office began operating in 1836, more than 5 million people have immigrated to Austria from Germany. By the end of 1847, the population of the Austrian Empire was expected to exceed 49 million. 38.5 million at the same period in history. The German population would be close to 15 million, the Italian population would be 12 million, and the Hungarian population would still be around 6.5 million. Of the remaining 14.5 million people, the largest number is Czechs, 4.5 million, including Bohemians, Moravians and Slovaks. 1.5 million Poles, 1 million Ukrainians, 3 million Croatians, 570,000 Serbs, 1.6 million Slovenes, 100,000 Montenegrins. and 2.33 million Transylvanians in addition. There are millions of Jews and hundreds of thousands of Roma, gypsies, in Austria, but in the eyes of European statisticians at the time, they were not considered human beings. The actual population of the Austrian Empire would exceed 50 million, more than the population of France and Spain after the Union. France has 35 million, Spain has 13 million, the United Kingdom has 28 million. The United States has 22 million, Mexico has 5.6 million, and Prussia has 18 million. Although Austria has attracted many people from the German Confederation, the total population of the German Confederation has actually increased compared to the same period in history, with a total population of 35 million. 34 million in the same period in history, because if Austria did not absorb these populations, they would all flow to the United States, the British colony, and become its cornerstone point. In addition, Russia has 76 million and Ottoman has 33 million. Austria is now the second most populous country in Europe and the fourth in the world. France has 35 million, the UK has 27 million, Spain has 13 million, and the United States has 21 million. Due to constant wars, civil wars, foreign wars, and land loss, Mexico's population is smaller than at the same time in history, only 5.5 million. Ottoman 33 million, Brazil 6.6 million, Argentina 1.8 million, Persia 13 million, Serbia 950,000. Denmark 1.5 million, Portugal 3.7 million, Sweden 3.4 million, Egypt 5.3 million, Afghanistan 2.5 million, and the Sikh Empire 12 million. Due to the acquisition of Limburg and West Luxembourg, Luxembourg's land area tripled and its population increased 1.5 times to 470,000. Regarding the population of Russia, there are estimates ranging from 67 million to 83 million. The average here is 75 million. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 836, The Fate of Closure. The United States was also extremely uncomfortable at the moment. Polk's unexpected death and the British's treachery plunged the US government into chaos. Polk was actually a very diligent president. In contrast, interim President Dallas was an out-and-out playboy. Although he was 55 years old, he was still as good as ever and often wandered around in debauchery. As for the pile of affairs, it fell on the new vice president. In fact, this person had never expected to enter the White House. He knew that his abilities were limited, but he looked down on Polk because he was a country bumpkin. Becoming an interim president just requires someone to take the blame. Since tearing up the trade agreement with the United Kingdom, the British have begun a series of trade sanctions. In fact, the British, who are in the midst of an economic crisis, have long wanted to find an outlet for their conflicts. It is easier to turn domestic conflicts abroad than to resolve them. Although the British and the French had fought fiercely in Spain before, both sides did not recognize the war. The French used the Foreign Legion, while the British sent Irish to the Spanish battlefield. Britain and France are opponents at the same level, but the Americans are different. To be honest, there are really no major powers on the European continent that take it seriously. The reason why the Americans have repeatedly defeated the British in history is not because of the magical performance of the anti-British heroes. In fact, in several maritime confrontations between the two countries, the British did not even exert a finger of strength. The two sides started to stand up, and the Americans didn't even have a chance of winning. The top brass knew, but the civilians didn't. They only knew that interim President Dallas was traitorous to the country. It was the northern factories that reaped the benefits of trade protection, while it was the southern manor owners who suffered the hammer from British sanctions. Naturally, the latter could not sit still and started active activities to impeach Dallas. Despite the increased tariffs, industry in the American North did not develop as rapidly as it had historically. Because of the lack of cheap Irish workers, wages for American workers were astronomically high at this time, averaging $15 a month, or $180 a year. This is almost 3 times that of the Austrian workers and 5 times that of the Prussian workers. In addition, The United States also highlights shoddy manufacturing and poor craftsmanship. Coupled with high labor costs, their products are simply uncompetitive. Point at this time, Americans could not only buy dumped goods from Britain, but also smuggled goods from France and Austria. These industries were of high quality, low price, and had a wide variety of products. Naturally, they had no interest in American goods at all. The result is that the trade protection policy was originally implemented to develop the domestic economy, but it was accidentally involved in the economic crisis. In fact, due to the economic downturn, all countries have reduced orders accordingly, but the cotton and wheat grown in the fields cannot be turned into anything else. This is the case for agricultural exporting countries, which have extremely poor risk resistance. None of this was something that interim President Dallas could handle. In order to avoid being embarrassed by someone when he went out, he simply invited people to the White House to hold a party. However, at this time, a French scholar's open letter still gave Americans some comfort. The famous Tocqueville came to the same conclusion again and again. Slaveholding states aside, the Americans are not only the most enlightened people in the world, but, and I add this to the above advantages, they accept its practical education and political education are also the most advanced among all ethnic groups. Alexis de Tocqueville, a French scholar and politician, is the author of On Democracy in America and the Apocalypse of Some People in the East in Later Generations, specifically referring to some people who only look at their names. The reason why Tocqueville came to this conclusion again was because he saw that his homeland, France, was in chaos. He knew that a disaster was just around the corner, but that was exactly what he expected. Tocqueville decided to find a hotel with a better location. He opened the window and smelled the smell of gunpowder in the air. He wanted to witness this period of history. When Tocqueville deliberately found a 3-story hotel with a direct view of the city and the prince, he felt that no one had a better position than him. So Tocqueville lay contentedly in bed and waited for the world to change. At this time, 2 bearded men were stewing a sauerkraut pot on the rooftop of the top floor on the other side of the European continent. Hungary. You, Abscess is on the motherland. What should I say to you? I'm going to burn you. I'm fire. I'm not fire. No destructive flame. But I have a sharp voice. I'm going to put a curse on you. Curse you with the most vicious words. Does the motherland have a treasure house? Is there any wealth that cannot be tolerated? Motherland. My poor motherland. He was so sick and so poor, and you robbers, but he is holding the medicine money that his motherland bought with his blood and sweat. You take them to foreign countries, altars dedicated to foreign idols. You have no mercy on this motherland. It's stuck in the mud begging for food when it bleeds and sheds tears, but you fill your wine glasses in foreign countries. In 1847, Petofi was a very talented poet. Franz was afraid of his harsh words, so he helped him when he was in trouble in his early years and allowed him to complete his studies in Vienna. 9 years ago, a severe flood destroyed Petofi's family and made them paupers overnight. The relatives who owed money to their family simply refused to pay back the debt, forcing the Petofi family, who originally had some wealth, to become butchers' apprentices to pick up some unwanted offal. However, Franz directly used his connections to help the Petofi family find out and recover the debt. Later, he provided Petofi with a scholarship to study in Vienna and even arranged for Count Zhnie to travel more with him, hoping to change the view of this great poet. However, sometimes fate is so unpredictable. After Petofi arrived in Vienna, he found that he was incompatible with the place, and then met those classmates who spent a lot of money. The prosperity of Vienna was completely different from the Karlsruhe village where he lived. The bustling traffic and rapid changes in the metropolis not only did not make Petofi yearn for it, but made the child who came from a small village feel a deep inferiority complex. He saw the great Hungarian aristocrats spending huge sums of money in the nightclubs of Vienna and swaggering through the city in luxurious carriages. A piece of clothing from those aristocratic children could buy all the land in his family. Then there was the exaggerated amount of scholarships provided by Franz. Petofi's ancestors and grandchildren could not save so much money despite their efforts. Petofi was confused. Count Zhenie said it was luck, but he felt it was not the case. The students around him cast envious glances, but he didn't know why. Was he really lucky? Or a clown who is at the mercy of others? After all, my classmates occasionally use a big silver coin. florin, to tease beggars. Is this scholarship a silver coin in the pocket of a big shot? At this time, Potofi suddenly got a copy of the Pest Daily. Count Szechenyi said that Kossuth wanted to destroy Hungary and was a madman point, but Potofi felt that what Kossuth said was the truth. After that, he returned to Hungary to follow Kossuth's footsteps, regardless of Count Szechenyi's attempts to stay. October 19, 1847. Potofi married Senda Yulia Point on this day. He vowed to overthrow the rule of the Austrian Empire and defeat the blood-sucking monster lying on the heads of the Hungarians. Potofi wrote the famous song Freedom and Love. Life is precious, but love is even more valuable. When it comes to freedom, both can be thrown away. As soon as this poem came out, the whole audience was in an uproar. Everyone knew what it meant, but the guests did not flinch. They were all young people with the same ideals as Potofi, and they all believed that Kossuth would lead them to victory. Chapter 837. Entrusted to an inhumane person. In fact, Kossuth was in some trouble at this time. At this time, he was no longer the little lawyer who only had a reputation in history. In fact, Count Szechenyi, who was supported by Franz, engaged in a series of debates with him. As a result, Count Szechenyi lost so much that he lost his pants. His cautious reform theory was dismissed as toilet paper, and he was on the wrong side of the aisle. According to Szechenyi's theory, the abolition of serfdom and giving farmers their original land would offend the great nobility. Because this will redivide those large farms into countless scattered pieces of land, which may be a good thing for farmers, and prevent the big nobles from playing tricks in land distribution. But the farm costs of the great nobles will rise sharply, and who will pay for the land liberated by the serfs? Szechenyi hoped that the state, serfs, and landowners would share the responsibility, which was unacceptable to the landed aristocracy. This operation is equivalent to the nobles not only giving up feudal power, but also destroying the original farms, and finally having to pay a sum of money. Szechenyi also wanted to abolish guilds and price restrictions, because France had abolished the guild system in the last century, and Britain had already consigned 99% of its guilds to the dust of history in the 16th century. Only the Booksellers Guild barely survived because of the British government's need to control speech, but it also declined at the end of the 18th century. However, this is Hungary, not France, nor Britain. Those guilds are the main force behind his plan to develop the capitalist economy, and these people cannot easily give up their power. On the other hand, if there were no price restrictions, then Hungarian goods would be directly overwhelmed by Austrian goods, and the productivity levels of the two parties were not on the same line at all. Both the abolition of guilds and the abolition of price restrictions were unacceptable to the Hungarian bourgeoisie. At that time, Szechenyi had a very good idea. He hoped to allocate land to farmers, so that they would be motivated to work. At the same time, guilds and price restrictions were abolished, and every household participated, allowing handicrafts to flourish again. In this era, Hungary's textile industry was still stuck in the cottage industry era, similar to the declining Prussian Silesia region. But in the industrial age, this pastoral life of men farming and women weaving was obviously a little too naive. Moreover, in Hungary, there are no comrades of his in the parliament among the people who can read newspapers. Szechenyi's actions and ideals directly offended the great nobles and businessmen. At the same time, he regarded serfs and other lower races living in the territory of St. Stephen's Crown as Hungarians. This approach angered radical nationalists, and as a result, he didn't even have a single friend. On the other hand, Kossuth continued to improve his theories in the debate with Count Szechenyi. Coupled with his amazing speaking skills and charisma, he has become the leader of the Hungarian nation. In addition to the merchants and single-clothed nobles who originally supported him, due to a series of operations by the Hungarian government in recent years, his prestige in the empire has dropped again and again. At the same time, as Austria joined the German customs union and Franz's series of reforms, the gap in strength between the two sides further widened. Feeling a sense of crisis, the great nobles hope to at least retain their privileges and Hungary's special status. Then someone needs to take the lead in making trouble, but they don't think they can defeat Austria, so they need a scapegoat. As a result, the forces of the three parties finally gathered together, and Kossuth now had all the fame, wealth, and status. In particular, The property obtained from intercepting and killing the leader of the Polish Restoration Army was now stored in Kossuth's personal name. As long as he wanted to, he could fly away and have food and clothing for the rest of his life. But human desires are endless, and after those who admired him listened to his praises for a long time, Kossuth really thought that he was different. Kossuth believed that he was the savior of the Hungarian nation. There was only one way before him, and that was victory. However, as far as Kossuth's personal experience is concerned, he still hopes to solve the problem through negotiation as much as possible, because several previous battles made him feel that the Austrian army was terrifying. And he never lost in a fight. Borzsony Lajos was also an enlightened Hungarian nobleman who had traveled to Western Europe. He was also a moderate. The Austrian Imperial government had high hopes for him. After all, he had joined the Austrian army and had lived in Vienna for a long time. Prime Minister Metternich was not ignorant of what was happening in Hungary. On the contrary, he knew everything too well, but he felt that a war between the two sides was impossible. Although the Hungarians screamed fiercely, they did not take any actual actions. They did not expand the army, hoard food, or raise funds to purchase weapons. Metternich actually wanted to bribe Kossuth and give him a large sum of money and a less important official position, but he did not succeed. This was not the first time Metternich wanted to use bribery to deal with Kossuth. Previously, the former pardoned the latter from prison and appointed him as the editor-in-chief of the government-run newspaper Pest. As a result, Kossuth was not grateful, but passionately praised Hungarian nationalism in the newspapers. The most frightening thing was that it took more than a month for the news to reach Vienna due to poor information. Metternich hurriedly dismissed him, but he could not throw him into prison again, because the Hungarians elected him as a state representative, and the Prime Minister of the Austrian Empire had no power to deal with Hungarian representatives. After 2 failed bribes, Metternich took a more direct approach and hired assassins to kill the man directly. But unfortunately, it was not just Prince Metternich who wanted Kossuth's death, but also many conservative nobles who did not want to give up their power. As a result, several assassination teams fought together. Kossuth has experienced many assassinations and has already developed escape skills. Later, as his reputation grew, some military nobles were willing to serve as his bodyguards and began to counteract the assassination, making the possibility of a successful assassination even lower. So Metternich decided to change his tactics. He also wanted to use moderates to check the radicals, and Borzsony Lajos was the person he chose. But what Metternich didn't know was that the moderate he chose would be Hungary's first prime minister, and he would fight Austria until death. Execution. In fact, the Hungarians were not unprepared. They established a number of steel factories and gunpowder factories, but they lacked raw materials. In fact, only the Tesz region in Hungary has both coal and iron resources, but none of the Hungarian steel plants with huge investment was built in this town. These steel plants actually belong to different families and are within different spheres of influence. And not only are their business philosophy and location selection backward, they are also in a mess on the technical level. To put it bluntly, these so-called steel plants are just a bunch of larger blacksmith shops, but they are not an exception at this time, including the well-known Krupp Steel, which is actually of this nature. Chapter 838 The Last Audience. At this time, Hungary accounted for 4 of the 10 largest steel plants in the Austrian Empire. However, they occupy the last 4 places, and the total output of these 4 steel plants is still not comparable to that of the 6th-ranked Bohemian steel plant. The total output of the remaining 9 companies in this ranking is still less than that of a blast furnace in the Franz steel works. This is an absolute gap in technology. This is the dividing line that I don't want to show off outside a checkpoint on the Prussian-Austrian border. 2 soldiers, one tall and one short, both carrying guns, stopped a family. They looked like refugees fleeing, but this was obviously not a checkpoint for refugees. The young man was used to being asked for cards, so he took out a wad of banknotes and handed them to the leading soldier. The 2 young soldiers were a little confused. To be honest, they had only heard of such a thing, but had never encountered such a thing. The tall and thin soldier among them was moved and stretched out his hand, but the other short and fat soldier quickly knocked the former's hand away. "What are you doing?" the tall and thin soldier cried out in pain, but soon realized something was wrong, and winked at his brother. The pudgy soldier leaned forward and said, "Look at this boy, even though he is dusty, but you can tell he is a noble at first glance. Then look at his wife." The tall, thin soldier looked over and saw a dignified and beautiful woman, smiling politely at him. "Quite good looking, good looking. Then you can tell at a glance that they are not refugees, okay? Do you think they look like poor people who can't afford to eat? I heard that the last time Archduke Albrecht personally visited the border post incognito, a blind man was hit by 50 big-eared melon seeds, and all the teeth in his mouth were knocked out. I heard that Archduke Albrecht was a giant and as strong as a brown bear. The man in front of me looks gentle, idiot. Can't it be some other Grand Duke? A group of big nobles have nothing to do after they've had enough to eat. Who knows what they are going to do? I don't think he's so skinny that he can slap all my teeth out." The tall and thin soldier was obviously not thinking on the same page as the short and fat soldier, and the latter was furious. "Then, are you sure he won't use any props? For example, that marble fan?" The tall, thin soldier immediately covered his mouth. Note: the marble fan mentioned by the pudgy soldier is actually the ivory folding fan in the lady's hand, but few ordinary people have seen ivory. "What should we do? Let old Bart handle it. Let's not wade into this muddy water, then." The squat soldier shouted, "Sergeant Bart! Sergeant Bart! Come on. We found a group of suspicious people." The young lady was a little nervous. After all, suspicious people were a very scary term in their country. The young man was helpless and had no choice but to comfort his wife while waiting for Sergeant Bart's arrival. This reminded him of his experience when he first arrived in Prussia, where he was treated as a spy or other suspicious person by a group of soldiers. Finally, a veteran who had been marinating in the wine vat was called. He burped with wine and asked in a voice that could almost burst his eardrums, "Who are you? Where did you come from?" The young man is a very well-educated gentleman, and he is not willing to cause trouble, let alone answer with this rude gentleman. "It says it on my pass. I'm too lazy to look." The young couple were speechless for a while. They discovered that compulsory education in Prussia was not as good as they said. At least the person in front of them was most likely illiterate. Fortunately, the young man had studied Prussian law and had come into contact with Russian soldiers who were more barbaric than the Prussian soldiers. Under Prussian law, however, before the young man finished speaking, the veteran was half awake from his wine. He knew that the guy in front of him was very difficult to deal with and immediately said impatiently, "Let's go." The young man still took off his hat politely, but did not smile, for fear that it would be considered a provocative behavior by the other party. After a while, Sergeant Bart appeared carrying a grilled fish. The Austrians and Prussians all looked similar, at least the officials were similar. Sergeant Bart casually opened the young man's pass with the hand that was not holding the grilled fish, and his eyes immediately became round. His move did not frighten the young couple, but it frightened the two soldiers beside them. They felt as if they had offended a big shot. Sergeant Bart inserted the wooden skewer for grilling fish into a nearby tree stump, then wiped his hands on his clothes, and then carefully picked up the pass book. "By the order of His Majesty Emperor Nicholas I hope that the military and police in various places will inspect and release high-ranking court attendants, privy councillors, recipients of the Order of Saint Vladimir, ministers of the Interior who were commended by the Emperor for their bravery and were awarded golden swords with inscriptions." Perovsky signed. The two soldiers didn't understand it, but they thought it was very powerful. The young couple were amused by the non-commissioned officer in front of them who liked to read aloud. It seemed that the Austrians were not so barbaric and ignorant, but they read slowly and with a strange accent, which seemed a bit funny. When Russians learn German, they mainly hire teachers from Prussia. Most of their marriage partners are also North Germans, so they feel that the North German accent is the authentic German. In fact, the destination of their trip was Paris, France, but at the strong suggestion of a friend, they decided to visit Vienna first. In fact, a friend said that the whole of Austria is worth visiting because the Austrian tour guides are really enthusiastic and knowledgeable. It is hard to imagine why such women would go out to work. My friend concluded that Austrian men like to eat soft food, just like their royal family. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Maria, who lost her friend, seemed a little lonely. Recently, she started to learn to draw point. Her 3 noisy brothers didn't think there was anything strange about this, and Mrs. Sophie was happy because her daughter finally did something like a girl point. As for Archduke Franz Carol, he thought it was time to have a drink with Maria and have a chat. Point Franz had no choice but to pat his father and tell him next time, and then called the guards to carry him away. Point Franz felt that he had to do this himself. So he approached the little girl who was painting seriously. Then Franz discovered a very modern painting, which was probably a broken ship carrying various strange creatures or things in the sea, and a huge ugly man with crooked eyes and drooling eyes. The captain is at the helm. At this time, Maria also noticed Franz's arrival, and the little girl began to introduce her paintings enthusiastically. The 3 unhealthy looking mice with 1 ear, 1 eye, and half a head are Maximilian, Ludwig, and Victor, the old monster chasing behind, holding a knife and fork, and spitting fire from his mouth, was Madame Sophie, and the seal beside him, drinking and patting his belly, was Archduke Franz Carol. Then, "This is me." Franz pointed at the creature that looked like a captain. "No, you're the ship." Chapter 839 Palmer Troubles. Mary Louise fell ill on December 9, 1847, and her condition continued to worsen. When the news reached Vienna at first, no one cared. In the eyes of most people, this is just a new trick used by the Grand Duchess to gain sympathy. The former Queen of France has lost everything in people's eyes, including her credibility, beauty, integrity, 2 husbands, son, and father. At this time, Austria is still preparing for Christmas, and various government departments are preparing year-end summer as the workers have already received their wages at this time. It is the richest time of the year, and some smart businessmen are nervously preparing to make a final profit. In fact, even if those people are not smart, Franz's Royal Mall is having a big promotion, so they can't help but be smart. The carp production in the Austrian Empire has increased tenfold in 3 years, but the sales volume during normal times is not very good, and only during the Christmas period does it show explosive growth. One is due to traditional concepts, and the other is that the price of carp is not low enough and ordinary people still cannot afford it. Third, the main reason is that wars have been raging in recent years. Although the war has not reached the Austrian mainland, people have already felt the crisis. Many families are hoarding daily necessities, even guns and ammunition. People don't have money, so they naturally don't have the ability to buy carp. Franz's promotion strategy is to directly give carp as a gift after spending a certain amount of money. This can minimize people's resistance, and at the same time he can continue to promote this ingredient and clear inventory. Early generators have been successfully developed, but the efficiency at this time is still not high, and the cost of cold storage is too high, so Franz must dispose of those precious carp as soon as possible. Although the situation at home and abroad is very tense, Franz obviously has more money on his books than in previous years. The giant bear, Karina von der Lent, although she has no business talent, is good at fighting corruption and auditing accounts. She has almost no friends, and her background as a military aristocrat makes her have almost nothing to worry about. The Delent family actually came from Russia, but they had settled in Austria for hundreds of years, and their ancestors had followed Wallenstein. However, no one knows the original surname of their ancestors. It is speculated that they are most likely escaped Russian serfs or Cossacks. Later generations followed the ancestral precepts and have been serving the Austrian army for hundreds of years. They are neither engaged in business nor politics, so their reputation is not obvious. Outliers like the Delent family are easily ostracized by the mainstream nobles, but they are proud of it because they also look down on those weaklings who only know how to spend their days drinking and begging for mercy. Therefore, Karina's series of thunderous methods of revenge are completely proof of honor in the eyes of her family. Old Delent, Karina's grandfather, led the family to cut down all the trees near the ancestral home and purchased a batch of weapons and bulletproof carriages to fight hard. Coupled with the escorts and bodyguards Franz added for it, the ancestral home of the Delent family became a hot potato. In order to prevent unnecessary trouble and someone taking advantage of the opportunity, all the escorts and bodyguards Franz purchased for him were public. At least to the public. Over the years, Franz has rarely failed in his plans on international events, but he has repeatedly failed in domestic issues. It is impossible for him not to reflect on his actions. In fact, Karina has also been assassinated, and the person who carried out the assassination was her assistant. But how could two civilian staff fight against a giant bear? One person was pushed out of the window from the 3rd floor by her before he could shoot, and the other person deflected the bullet in panic. When the guards outside the door ushered in, the civil servant who had been instigated to rebel had been beaten into a pig's head, with his face sunken, and one eyeball hanging out. The reason why some people can instigate rebellion against Franz's subordinates one after another is just the connections and prestige accumulated by those families over hundreds of years. If you want to completely eliminate this influence, you must either carry out a general cleaning, or build your own power, after ascending the throne, and give your subordinates the capital to make the other party afraid to move. Franz thinks that day will not be too far away. But what if the people he supports are also rubbish? No, he wants to break this cycle. On December 17th, 1847, Archduke Mary Louise finally passed away after suffering from pleurisy for more than 10 days. According to the tradition of the Habsburg family, the remains of the Archduchess will be transported back to Vienna and placed in the royal crypt. Mary Louise grew up in an environment that was very disgusting with France. Both Austria and the Habsburg family felt that France was stupid. As a result, for the sake of the overall situation, she had to marry this Tuo Ziyang. After that, Mary Louise encountered almost every tragedy a woman could encounter. Even before she died, no one believed her and no one cared about her. In fact, the Austrian Imperial government was already in turmoil because of Mary Louise's death. They did not expect that the Archduchess would die so quickly and suddenly. But what they care about is not this poor victim, but the national interests of the Austrian Empire. According to the agreement of that year, after the death of the Grand Duchess, the Duchy of Parma will return to the rule of the Bourbon-Parma family. At this time, Austria's investment in Parma has not recovered its cost. If the Bourbon-Parma family moves closer to France, it will drive a nail into the hinterland of Austria and directly threaten the security of northern Italy. The current head of the Bourbon-Parma family is Charles II, grandson of Ferdinando I, Duke of Parma, and son of Ludwig I, King of Etruria. From 1803 to 1807. He was the King of Etruria, known as Ludwig II. From 1824 to 1847, he was a Duke of Lucca, known as Carlo I. Carlo II was settling in the Principality of Lucca at this time. In fact, this principality was also indirectly controlled by the Habsburg family, so Carlo II's presence was so thin that people almost forgot about his existence. Theoretically, if Carlo II inherited the Duchy of Parma, the Est line of the Habsburg family would be able to regain control of Lucca. This means nothing to Austria, it's just a left hand to a right hand. But once Parma falls into the hands of the Bourbon family, it will directly threaten the map of northern Italy. However, it is not so easy for Austria to break the contract, let alone the international impact. The great powers alone will not miss this opportunity. France wants to compete with Austria for dominance in the Apennine Peninsula. Britain wants to stir up trouble. Prussia hopes to weaken the two great powers Austria and France, and Russia both hates France, and does not want Austria to be too powerful. At this time, Carlo II was still considering whether to turn to France or Austria, or to create a miracle by doing both. But soon he would have no choice, because France would not be able to hold on any longer. At this time, Franz was considering whether to let Louis Philippe retire from the game, or put him in another place to shine. After all, Napoleon III's attitude towards Austria was not exactly friendly. Chapter 840. The end of the world is at this moment. South Africa, Cape Colony. Suddenly a large number of German immigrants came here, especially many of them carrying weapons, which made the locals feel a little nervous. Fortunately, there were British troops following them, so they did not cause panic in the Cape Colony. Soon people learned that the British Empire sold the Northern Orange and Transvaal to the German Confederation, and these German immigrants were supposed to come to receive the land. This brought a long sigh of relief to the locals, because there were many sinister presences among the German immigrants. In fact, the one who was happiest about this news was John Norton's family. Old Norton's son, Joshua Norton, was at odds with him and went to England and the United States to do business in his early years. As a result, due to some changes in history, Joshua Norton, who was supposed to achieve great success, lost everything in the British and American real estate markets at this time. The latter had no choice but to return home and inherit the family property, but John Norton succeeded in getting himself into a lot of debt. Through these years of hard work, while father and son were complaining to each other, news came that Britain had sold Orange and Transvaal to the German Confederation. This didn't matter to most colonists, but it was great news for the Norton family, who had already purchased a large amount of land. Because northward expansion is blocked and land supply is reduced, land prices are bound to rise. At this time, Joshua Norton was full of confidence. He also heard about another thing at this time, that is, a large gold mine was discovered in California. Old Norton was very angry because he felt that his son should stay as a landowner and pass on their family's land. Old Norton, damn it. If you can be a rent collector, you have to be a digger, Joshua Norton immediately retorted, who said I was going to be a miner. Old Norton, damn it. Don't you want to dig for gold in North America? I'm going to North America to dig for gold. That's right. After hearing this, Old Norton wanted to whip his son with his cane, but his wife stopped him. Then, you said you're not going to dig some dirt. No, I beat you to death. Old Norton was so angry that he raised his crutch again, but was stopped by his wife again. Honey, calm down. Mrs. Norton spanked her eldest son again. You kid, finish your sentence in one sitting. Do you know? Since ancient times, few gold diggers have been able to make money and then, you still go. Old Norton roared, and Joshua Norton looked up at the sky. In desperation, Mrs. Norton could only urge her son to finish what he said. I'm not going to be a gold digger. I'm going to sell pots and pans, shovels, hammers, and picks. Before Joshua Norton finished speaking, Old Norton roared again, you worthless thing. They are digging for gold. Are you going to sell groceries? HMPH. I will definitely make money. If you dare, don't come back. I won't come back if I don't do well. So, His Majesty Norton decided to set off for his loyal San Francisco. Joshua Norton I, Emperor of the United States of America and Regent of Mexico, one of the hardcore ruthless men described by Little John. On the other hand, Andres Pretorius was not very happy either. Although he used the name of the German Confederation to scare away the British, he really managed to scare the Germans away. In fact, the German colonists far exceeded the so-called Boers in both quantity and quality. In fact, there are not many people of Dutch descent who think that they are Boers. There are only a few high-level officials who want to distinguish themselves from the British. Now the arrival of a large number of Germans, especially the arrival of a large number of nationalists, makes the locals feel that they are Germans. Franz had previously overestimated the nationalism of the Boers. In fact, their national consciousness had not yet awakened during this period, and the concept of the Boers was entirely forced by the British. At this time, the German Confederation came forward to solve the British troubles, and bought the land. Especially since everyone spoke the same language, they naturally believed that they should be Germans. As for the voices of Andres Pretorius and other leaders, they were drowned out by the church and nationalists in a very short time. Human beings are all eager to be strong. When it comes to knowledge, a group of doctors of theology and college students are no better than a few who have never gone to school. In terms of force, the newly arrived German immigrants included a large number of professional soldiers, anti-government armed members, and gang members. It only took them a very short time to beat the local indigenous people into chaos. The original bull leaders could only begin to promote the threat theory of the Germans, but the fact was that the Boers actually occupied only a small part of Orange and the Transvaal. The German Confederate immigrants began to stay in the local people's territory, but soon defeated the nearby indigenous people and opened up new pastures. However, German immigrants still preferred farming to herding. They brought improved seeds and new farming methods. Crops grew on land that was originally considered uncultivated by the Boers. Coupled with the advocacy of the magicians, this made the locals feel that it was God's blessing. Afterwards, immigrants from the German Confederation were continuously sent, and the total number soon approached the original number of Boers at this time. Some Boer leaders found that their resistance did not make much sense, because they could completely integrate into the society of the German Confederation. Moreover, immigrants from the German Confederacy brought many good things, including schools, hospitals, churches, advanced weapons and ideas, and laws. December 25, 1847. The Austrian Imperial government announced that it recognized Charles II, the head of the Bourbon-Parma family, as Grand Duke of Parma. This news excited Britain, France, and Prussia. For them, this was undoubtedly a huge diplomatic victory. It was also the first official concession by the Austrian Empire in recent years. Louis Philippe was ambitious and prepared to plant the Bourbon flag in Venice. The cabinet members are considering whether France can still defeat Austria at this time. The growing deficit and shrinking income make them less confident. Marshal Soult is counting the time for his retirement. He will retire honorably in 6 months. John Russell was very happy that the two major powers in Europe were one step closer to leaving the war. Palmerston was also very happy, but he was not so optimistic. He always felt that something would happen, because this time the Austrians compromised so easy. In fact, it was not that Metternich wanted to compromise, but the whole of Europe wanted France and Austria to fight. But Louis Philippe did not know how to restrain himself. He was also helpless. Prussia is actually somewhat unable to protect itself, because the separatist forces in the Rhine region are getting stronger and stronger, and the entire Prussia is about to be torn apart. However, William IV was still very happy to be able to weaken Austria and France at the same time. As for Russia, the messenger is still on the way. The Confederate immigrants in South Africa had no Christmas tree, so they decorated a baobab tree. Franz spent this unstable Christmas with his family according to the family's design. After Christmas he will go to Tyrol to learn how to manage the country and city as deputy king. Chapter 841. The First Shot. January 9, 1848, Italy. In Palermo, the capital of Sicily, a notice appeared on the city wall. Sicilians. Protests, petitions, peaceful demonstrations have proved useless. Ferdinand II has shown that in his eyes there is only contempt for us. Free people have been chained to misery on the chain. How long do we have to wait to get our legitimate rights and interests back? Take up arms, sons of Sicily, we take up arms. The most ridiculous thing is that the kingdom of the two Sicilies only regarded this as a joke at this time. Ferdinand II even planned to hold a grand birthday celebration on January 12. 3 days later, in fact, continuous disasters have plunged agriculture into an unprecedented low, and the global economic crisis has destroyed its handicraft industry. Amid internal and external difficulties, another heavy snowfall destroyed people's hopes for the future. The people believed that this was all the fault of King Ferdinand II, and the indifference of the government and the royal family further stimulated the people. The former Ferdinand II was an enterprising king. As soon as he came to power, he carried out a large number of reforms, selected talents, eliminated accumulated abuses, and strived to create a clean and efficient government. Afterwards, Ferdinand II reduced taxes, abolished labor, encouraged industry, developed trade, established education, promoted talents in an exceptional manner, and even established early welfare institutions. Under his promotion, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies established the earliest railway in Italy, Naples Portage Railway, the first navigation company in Italy, and the first telegraph company on the Apennines. Ferdinand II was once considered the most likely king to reunite Italy, but at this time he just wanted to live out his life in mediocrity. 3 days later, January 12, 1848. At the celebration of the king's birthday, someone took out the red, white, and green flags symbolizing Italy. Afterwards, people took up arms and rushed to the palace as a notice suggested. At this time, in order to allow himself to have a stable birthday, Ferdinand II mobilized 5 regiments of troops to maintain order in front of the palace, and an entire fleet remained in the port. In addition, there are a large number of military police, spies, strong fortresses and dark cannons in the city. All the rebels together only had 500 guns. They were craftsmen from various guilds, refugees fleeing famine, and bankrupt craftsmen. They did not belong to each other, and they were a typical mob. No one thinks the latter can win. Ferdinand II pulled his 12-year-old eldest son, who was later King Francesco II, to stand on the balcony on the second floor of the palace. He wanted to see with his own eyes how the mob was destroyed. The father and son were ready to watch a bloody massacre, but at this time the Zanka Charlotte, a close minister of Ferdinand II, stepped forward. "Your Majesty, the dirty blood should not stain your eyes. Just leave this to the humble minister." Ferdinando II was unmoved. "I want to see how those ungrateful guys were crushed by my army. Damn the unscrupulous people. They actually blamed me for the natural disaster." The locust plague was clearly summoned by Pius IX. In fact, Pius IX also collected debts from the kingdom of the Two Sicilies, and all the debts from Murat's period were also counted on his head, so the relationship between the two parties was very bad. The Zanka Charlotte was a little at a loss, because he was a traditional nobleman, and respected the Pope. At least he did not dare to scold the Pope in front of others like the king. Of course, as a smart man, he did not want to offend the king, so he only suggested it again after Ferdinand II's anger subsided. "Your Majesty, when a war breaks out, guns and cannons have no eyesight. It would be bad if you accidentally hurt your Majesty and the prince." Ferdinand II thought it made sense, so he decided to go back to the palace for a while. Anyway, there were high wild fortresses and more than 10,000 troops outside, and the opponent only had 500 mobs, and there was no reason to lose. The king has run away. A roar and a gunshot shocked everyone, and also kicked off the vigorous prelude to the spring of all nations. Something happened that Ferdinando II couldn't understand. 15 minutes after he left, his army was broken through the defense line. The whole city was filled with rout troops, and 500 people rushed towards the palace. In fact, after the French Revolution, the word revolution was enough to scare all nobles, whether it was the Industrial Revolution or any other revolution. Another unexpected reason was that Ferdinand II left the balcony. The king's sudden departure directly put the morale of the army on the verge of collapse. A cry of "the king has run away" directly shattered the remaining fighting spirit of the soldiers. If Ferdinand II had never left, or never appeared on the balcony, the situation would at least not have been so bad. "Don't let Ferdinand II escape," someone shouted. Afterwards, Ferdinand II fought and retreated under the desperate protection of the royal guards, and hurriedly fled into the port of Palermo to survive. Ferdinando II, who fled to the battleship, looked at the rebels cheering in the port in the distance, and heard the sounds of "Long live Italy" and "Long live Pius IX." From time to time, "Damn Pius IX." Ferdinando II spat fiercely into the sea. He knew that those rebels had no ability to break through his defense line. The big devil Pius IX must have used some spell. In fact, the banner of the Italian unification movement at this time was Pius IX, because after he came to power, he issued a general amnesty to the world, and many demons and ghosts were released together with political prisoners. These people lived up to expectations, and began to cause trouble in various places. The city of Rome was flooded with slogans such as "Long live the Pope," "Death to Austria," and "Long live Italy." Even the French ambassador thought the Pope was crazy. He wrote in a letter to King Louis Philippe of France, "The Pope is digging his own grave. His crazy behavior puts even the most brutal violent revolutionaries to shame." Some secret leaflets even claimed that the Jesuits are an Austrian conspiracy. The Pope is under control, and only by driving the Austrians out of Italy can the Holy See be saved. Just when rebels everywhere were preparing for uprisings, Pius IX suddenly decided to set up a consultative committee to openly seek ways to save the Italian nation from the people. In fact, Pius IX wanted to mobilize the people to drive the Austrian side out and become the leader of Italy. But the reality is that the political prisoners he released were not interested in a papal Italy and demanded more rights. The monks in the consultative committee were quickly dismissed, and radical nationalists emerged on the stage of history. Under the connection of these people, a large number of horse racing clubs appeared in Italy. Just like the French banquet movement, they were not just horse racing clubs, but openly organized associations. Franz knew this very well. Alpacino Corleone was a Sicilian, and he knew this method of association very well. Franz naturally had a countermeasure, which was to arrest those without horses for fraud. In the end, everyone in the entire jockey club actually had to bring a horse, which greatly raised the threshold for membership. At that time, the price of horses was not cheap, especially the follow-up costs. Moreover, Italy itself did not produce horses, and the total number of horses was not as high as that of Belgium before the disintegration. However, the reality is that the nationalists in northern Italy are not easy to deal with. They launched a smoking cessation campaign on January 1, 1848. In fact, the planners originally planned to recreate the Tea Party in North America that year, but as soon as they poured out 2 boxes of tobacco, someone lost their money. Obviously, Austria's security force in northern Italy is much stronger than that of Britain and North America, and Alpacino Corleone, a local gangster, and his Sicilian gang are the underground managers of the docks. But Franz didn't want too much bloodshed, so he only asked the nationalists to pay. But the price of tobacco at that time was not cheap, and the arrested nationalists were unable to pay off their debts. In order to avoid being sent to the colonies to pay off their debts, they had no choice but to identify the real culprits behind the scenes. Franz still used fines to deal with them, which was particularly effective against the middle class. Many people grew old overnight, but they had no choice but to do so, because they had the support of the law, and both the person and the person gained the stolen goods. In fact, many people become less radical after losing their property. Moreover, the people at the bottom like to see these people being unlucky. Report letters gradually increase, and some people even make a living from it. In desperation, the nationalists in northern Italy could only quit smoking. In fact, Franz had always advocated quitting smoking and limiting alcohol. After all, tobacco and alcohol were not good things. After the smoking cessation campaign began in northern Italy, Franz even sent people to promote the harmful effects of smoking. It's just that the so-called harmful effects of smoking at that time were all nonsense without scientific basis, because people who smoke and drink are obviously more energetic and live longer than people who don't smoke or drink. Although the nationalists in northern Italy can stop smoking or call on the people not to smoke, they cannot restrain the soldiers in the army. Tobacco was not cheap at that time, and it was not popular. At least most people at the bottom could not afford to smoke. Historically, it was not until paper cigarettes became popular that the number of smokers really began to approach the number of alcoholics. Although paper cigarettes were available in Austria at this time, they were not popular. Most people still liked to use pipes, snuff and the like, and the prices of these were too high for ordinary people. Although the price of tobacco is not high, the tax is very high. The reason why the nationalists in northern Italy launched the smoking cessation campaign was to attack Austria's tax revenue and thereby force the government to carry out reforms. I have to say that there must be government officials or experts who are familiar with taxation to help make suggestions. But now the Austrian treasury is much more abundant than in history, and it can still afford to spend dozens or millions. In fact, this amount of money is really not worth mentioning in the face of import and export duties, industrial taxes, agricultural taxes, and the funds of the Royal Development Company and the Austrian Merchant United Company. Except for Franz, the top officials in the empire did not even take this matter to heart. The local officials were very anxious, but not particularly anxious. At least they did not think that any special measures should be taken. However, the withdrawal reaction from nicotine is not so pleasant. On January 3rd, 2 days after the quit smoking campaign started, a group of smokers stormed a guard post and beat up a soldier who was smoking. Then a large number of soldiers arrived, and a physical conflict broke out between the two sides. Marshal Radetzky was very strict in managing the army. He did not want too many conflicts between the army and the locals, so the soldiers were very restrained and still maintained the level of fighting. However, some radical nationalists soon began to use weapons. When the violence escalated, the army soldiers turned into soldiers again and began to fight back quickly and decisively. Everything stems from the words given to the Italian Legion by the royal family: evil people should not be tolerated, and good people should not be wronged. Mentioned in the previous article, facing heavily armed and well-trained soldiers. How could those thugs with nicotine withdrawal symptoms resist them? The fighting, which may not have been a fighting at all, was quelled after 2 armed thugs were shot dead. Due to the decisive action taken, casualties were much lower than in history. Only 2 people died, and a dozen were slightly injured. In fact, the nobles and businessmen in Italy did not want to make things too serious, because they just wanted to achieve independent status like the Hungarians. To be honest, they are very satisfied with both the policies of the Austrian Empire and the market of the Austrian Empire. They have made a lot of money over the years, and their lives are not much better than those of their relatives and friends in other countries. However, after having money, they felt that they could go further. In fact, they are not necessarily nationalists, but because of the good example of Hungary, the nobles and businessmen in the Italian region also hope that the northern Italy region can also be independent, so that they will have enough power to protect their own interests. Officials in northern Italy also wanted to expand their power, so the 2 sides hit it off immediately, and a vigorous nationalist movement began. However, while they instigated the nationalists and the people at the bottom to cause trouble, they also sent people to start contacting the Austrian Imperial government. These people hope to make the Austrian Imperial government compromise under heavy pressure, but Metternich and Count Korolev have seen this kind of thing too many times. There are many people in the Austrian Empire who want to do this, and Bohemia is even more troubled at this time. If they compromised so easily, Austria would have been torn apart. So Metternich directly ordered the arrest of a group of nationalist leaders such as Daniel Manin, Niccolo Tomassia, Bishop Cossa, and Bishop Ambros. On the other hand, Marshal Radetzky felt strongly uneasy. As a veteran who had participated in the anti-French war, he knew the horror of turmoil. Marshal Radetzky said in a telegram to Vienna, "We must immediately take the strongest measures against those insane and radical reformists, and must extinguish this flame in the bud." However, the old marshal's surprising toughness did not attract the attention of the Vienna government, because according to usual experience, Metternich felt that, as long as the leader was arrested, the matter would soon calm down. However, a gunshot in Sicily shattered Metternich's dream, and the entire northern Italy became restless at this moment. Metternich finally smelled a strange smell, which was the salty and wet breath before a bloody storm. But the 74-year-old prime minister still didn't think anything could shake the Austrian Empire, which was well equipped with troops and food and a full treasury. What he didn't expect was that the scale of the coming storm, its destructive power, and its far-reaching impact would completely exceed everyone's estimates, including Franz, who was full of confidence at this time. Seeking votes at the end of the month. Chapter 842. Just in case. Vienna, Schönbrunn Palace. Franz knew exactly what was about to happen at this time. Over the years, the number of guards in the palace had increased from 800 to 2,000, and now to 8,000 at this time. The defense strength was 10 times the historical number. Vienna's old city walls were demolished and replaced by Franz's shops and factories. The advantage of this is that it can not only prevent the insurgents from building barricades, but also blow them up when necessary to form an isolation belt near the palace and the noble area as the last line of defense. At this time, the number of the city defense army did not change much from that in history. But after eliminating the old, weak, and young, under Albrecht's training, it had completely become a fighting force. This is an army composed of 20,000 nobles, equipped with the most expensive equipment in the entire Austrian Empire. Especially after experiencing the Winster incident and the anti-drug operation, the fighting will of the personnel has been greatly improved. In addition, the Austrian army deployed 100,000 garrison troops near Vienna, which was much higher than the same period in history. The most important thing is that in the context of the economic crisis, the economy of the Austrian Empire is still improving, and farmers have not had harvest failures and large-scale peasant flight incidents have not occurred. There were not a large number of refugees gathered in Vienna, nor were there many unemployed workers. Generally speaking, the people are in a relatively tolerable state, at least no one can survive. Due to the impact of the economy, a small number of factories and businessmen did go bankrupt, but the scale was small. Compared with the thousands of companies that go bankrupt in the UK and France a year, hundreds of companies go bankrupt every month on average. In December 1847, only 7 companies in Austria went bankrupt, and 2 of them were confiscated by France because of false accounting. In December of the same year, there were 104 companies in Paris, 97 companies in London, 61 companies in Prussia, and 28 companies in Russia. However, the main reason why there were fewer companies in Russia and Prussia was because they also had fewer companies. The development of railway transportation made the entire Austrian Empire more closely connected. In fact, if there was a rebellion in Vienna, garrisons from various places could arrive in 1 or 2 days, which greatly reduced the success rate and feasibility of the rebellion. Theoretically speaking, the uprising in Vienna lacked the necessary sunlight, soil and moisture at this time, but for the sake of safety, Franz made a second plan, which was the shelter in Tyrol. The North Tyrol region is surrounded by mountains, and is undoubtedly easy to defend and difficult to attack. Although the sparrow is small and has all the internal organs, the Tyrol region has basic agriculture and industry. In addition, under Franz's special care in recent years, the industrial and agricultural foundation has been much stronger than in history, and there is also the largest arsenal and weapons development department in Austria. Historically, Tyrol was also the only region in the Austrian Empire that did not experience rebellion during the year of the storm, the other being Galicia. There are many reasons to send people to Tyrol. After all, the beautiful scenery and close proximity to the Alps are very suitable for retirement, vacation, and leisure. Those literati, artists, and members of the royal family had no objection to this place. Franz could come over just by sending an invitation. What is difficult to deal with is that among the Austrian scientists, except for some who are engaged in biology and geography, most of them have little interest in mountains and rivers at this time. They were still in the stage where man could conquer nature, and they were not in the mood to stop and appreciate the beautiful scenery at all. In addition, the laboratories in Tyrol are not up to the level of the Vienna laboratories, which makes those engaged in scientific research even more disgusted. In particular, Babbage's design was all made of precision parts, and the Trinity analytical engine, which weighed dozens of tons, could be transported separately by train. But assembly is a big trouble. What's worse is that those precision instruments cannot withstand bumps, and small deviations will make the experimental data completely wrong. Babbage and his team would not be able to leave Vienna, so Franz respected the wishes of the computer pioneer, but for safety reasons, the latter reinforced the walls around the laboratory and built a doomsday fortress underground for them. Franz didn't want these scientists who had made great contributions to human history to make any mistakes, and the rest of them could only coax and lie. For example, in the legendary prophecy, people in this era still believe in religion. As for Prince Metternich, he still suggested that Franz should go to Tyrol for some experience. Of course, there was also a sense of protection. Because of the lessons learned from the French Revolution, it is difficult to guarantee that Vienna will be safe. Of course, from the bottom of his heart, he still believed that the Austrian Empire would survive this crisis unscathed, but he also wanted to have a backup plan and did not want to take any risks. The old prime minister's face looked very bad, obviously because he hadn't had a good rest recently. After some routine greetings and instructions, Franz spoke first. "Your Excellency, Prime Minister, you seem to be a little troubled. Is it because of things in Italy?" Metternich nodded, and now it was Franz's turn to be depressed, because they had already discussed matters about Italy before, and the former had adopted the latter's opinion to increase 50,000 troops to Italy. At this time, there were already 150,000 troops in northern Italy, among which the old commander Radetzky had 100,000 troops, which was much stronger than the 15,000 troops in history. "Your Majesty Prime Minister, do you think Marshal Radetzky is useless?" Radetzky is 82 years old, and I'm really worried about letting such an old man in his dying years lead the army. But Count Latter said that he was the best, and the other generals had no experience in leading more than 50,000 troops. If you are worried, you can transfer Archduke Karol to the Italian battlefield. Historically, Archduke Karol caught a cold after attending the funeral of Archduke Friedrich, and fell ill. When he returned home. However, Friedrich was not dead at this time, and Archduke Karol was naturally alive and well. Metternich frowned. For the first time, he discovered that this country was so old. In addition to the 82-year-old Marshal, there was also a 77-year-old Grand Duke, Archduke Franz. I hope you understand that letting Archduke Karol go to guard the ancestral land is an internal decision of the Habsburg family, not an administrative order from me. Metternich's meaning was obvious. He did not want to get involved in the internal affairs of the royal family. Italy still has Prince Schwarzenberg in charge, so the situation should not be out of control. Felix Schwarzenberg was actually a close confidant of Metternich. He was relatively reassured by this person, but he was not young anymore due to the same problem. Moreover, Prince Felix Schwarzenberg was better at strategizing than marching and fighting. His ability, experience, and prestige to adapt to changes on the battlefield were far inferior to Marshal Radetzky and Archduke Karol. But the matters in northern Italy were not what Metternich was worried about. In fact, he still had talented people such as Ferdinand Lizzi, Alois Palfi, and Archduke Rainer in his heart. Archduke Franz, I'm worried about what's going on in Sicily. At this time, there was a war on Sicily, but Franz was still confused. Your Majesty Prime Minister, I'm very sorry about what happened in Sicily, but the soldiers will cover up the water and the earth, so I don't think there is anything to worry about. Franz suddenly thought of something in the middle of speaking. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 843. Drag the word trick. Are you talking about the Holy Alliance? That's right, Metternich sighed. He never dreamed that one day this alliance used to protect Austria would turn around and cheat Austria. Metternich continued, the purpose of the Holy Alliance is to maintain the normal order of the world, oppose those radical democrats, and unite the kings of Europe to suppress possible uprisings. It was actually us who wanted to prevent France from making a comeback, but now what was happening in Sicily, if Ferdinand II came to us for help, the Austrian Empire would be involved in an unnecessary war. This reminds me of the past. The terrain of the Kingdom of France and Spain and the two Sicilies is very complex, and this will be a protracted war. Once we retreat, the so-called Holy Alliance will cease to exist in name only. In fact, the so-called Holy Alliance has long existed in name only, but Naples' request for help from Austria is really unsolvable. Because in addition to the Holy Alliance, there is also the Apennine Commercial Alliance, which is directly related to Austria's grand strategy in the Apennine region. If we directly refuse to send troops at this moment, all our efforts over the years will be in vain. But sending troops to southern Italy is definitely a bottomless pit, and it will also make Austria be labeled the executioner. But it's not completely unsolvable. Franz thought for a while and said, Your Excellency, we can first drag or bribe the ministers of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, so that they will not allow the king to write a letter asking for help. Metternich was a little confused. This was not Archduke Franz's style at all, but this was indeed the last option. It was better than being trapped in a dilemma and waiting to die. Moreover, Prince Metternich knew very well that the politics of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies was very corrupt, and those close ministers had a great influence on Ferdinand II. Archduke Franz's suggestion was absolutely feasible. This is also true. This approach is much more practical than diving headfirst into the quagmire. Archduke Franz, you are right. As long as no one asks us for help, we can pretend that we are invisible. But what if this fire gets hotter and stronger? There is always a solution to a problem. January 1848. Ferdinand II, who had just arrived at the royal palace in Naples, had not had time to take a breath when news of Sicily reached Naples. Similar to what happened a week ago, people took to the streets again. Royal guards of 15,000 people blocked the streets and people also built barricades at the same time. Uprisings broke out in many places in the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, and important cities such as Messina, Tarquania, and Trebania fell one after another. The Kingdom of the Two Sicilies claimed to have an army of 100,000 but it was already stretched thin at this time and was asking for help from everywhere. News of the defeat piled up on Ferdinand II's desk like snowflakes. Damn. Untouchables. It was me who taught them to read. It was me who made them live a good life. Now they actually want to rise up against me. These heartless bastards. The more Ferdinand II thought about it, the angrier he became. He couldn't understand why the people resisted him, and he couldn't understand why his army was so stretched. The kingdom of the Two Sicilies is only a small country, and it is not easy to raise an army of 100,000 people. Annual military expenditures must account for about half of the financial expenditure to maintain this large army. What Ferdinand II didn't know was that the kingdom of the Two Sicilies had never had an army of 100,000, and all he had to review each time were just some extras. The entire kingdom of Two Sicilies only has an army of more than 30,000 people at full strength. It is naturally stretched to face hundreds of thousands of rebels. Ferdinand II hated the country of Austria, but the most sensible thing for him to do at this time was to ask for help and use the help of the Austrians to quell the rebellion in the country. The brilliance of this move is that you don't have to spend a single soldier on your own, and you don't have to bear the reputation of being an executioner. However, his close minister Dzankalualu obviously had a different view. The latter hated this approach very much and felt that it was ungentlemanly and dishonorable. Moreover, what if Austria stayed in the Two Sicilies and refused to leave? Ferdinand II nodded in approval of this loyal minister and then said, "I am not willing to go to the Austrians, but the situation is forcing us to have a future only if we survive. Otherwise, like Louis XVI, then I will be the biggest sinner of the Bourbon family." As for the Austrians, they dare not stay in our territory because the great powers will force them to leave, and they cannot afford the cost of supplies. When the time comes, we don't need to drive them away at all. They will leave in despair. Your Majesty, let me lead the troops to charge again. Within 3 days, I will clear out the unruly people in the city. Dzanka. Charlotte said it sincerely, and Ferdinand II was greatly moved, but he still said it in a persuasive way. "Can you clear out the rebellion in Naples? Can you clear out the rebellion across the country? And there are not many loyal people around me. I want you to keep your life." There was an emotional drama between the king and his ministers, but in the end Ferdinand II decided to write a letter to the Holy Alliance asking for help. However, the messenger was stopped by Dzanka as soon as he walked out of the palace gate. "Sir, you called me," the messenger asked with some confusion. Dzanka Charlotte knew that this person was Ferdinand II's confidant, and without saying anything else, he shot the other person's head to pieces. The guard on the side quickly handed over a towel, and Dzanka wiped her hands. The messenger was killed by the rioters, and our bodies were only found on the outskirts of the city a month later. Do you understand? Understand, Dzanka? Charlotte nodded. In fact, he did not want to do this, but the kingdom of the Two Sicilies was so big that it would not be so easy to subdue the country. The rebels just wanted a constitution. Dzanka didn't want to worry about that much. He only knew that 1 million florins fell into his pocket. And even if the constitution is really promulgated, with his financial resources and influence, he is still a group of people at the top of the country. So Dzanka is not panic at all. On January 29th, Alexis de Tocqueville spoke in the French Chamber of Deputies. "I believe that at this moment, we are sleeping in the mouth of a volcano. Don't you instinctively feel that the European continent is shaking again? Don't you smell the breath of revolution in the air? Although there have been constant uprisings in France in the past year, no one thinks that this behemoth will collapse. In fact, this was an illusion, because Paris at this time was the quietest place in France, and there were so many uprisings and strikes in other provinces that local officials were too lazy to report them. However, Tocqueville's warning was nothing more than a new way of sensationalizing in the ears of France's top bureaucrats, who wanted to use alarmism to increase their own wealth. In the end, Tocqueville's words were only met with ridicule, and only liberals saw them as a means of attacking the government. At that time, even those orthodox and liberals who aimed to overthrow the Orleans dynasty did not think that an uprising in Sicily would have any impact on France. Chapter 844 Wildfire. The economic crisis in France is very special. Since the economic development of the entire France is very abnormal, the real big factory owners and big bankers do not feel the crisis deeply, but instead see it as an opportunity point. In fact, although French industry, agriculture, and finance are in mourning, the merger of leading forces has never stopped. During this period, a large number of monopolies and joint companies were born, and even cross-border joint super consortiums emerged. They are similar to the early Carthusian organizations. In response to the economic crisis, they maintained their high profits by entering into a series of agreements to control the output, prices, and even sales areas of goods on the market. The result was to further accelerate France's descent into the abyss. Bankers are even more exaggerated. They have gained astonishing wealth and transcendent political status through buying, selling, and controlling the price of government bonds according to the evaluation of Democracy Daily at the time. In France today, only bankers follow their lead. All power institutions such as the king, government, and parliament can only survive if they satisfy them. Bankers deduce their superior political status to begin to enact laws that benefited them, and at the same time, controlled public opinion. These, in turn, ensure that they can always enjoy privileges in economics, politics, and life. But there are exceptions to everything, and at this point the French no longer want to talk about them. Among them, the wealth election has caused widespread dissatisfaction. This law stipulates that only those who are 30 years old and have paid a direct tax of 500 francs can be elected. Only those who are over 25 years old and pay a direct tax of 200 francs have the right to vote. Gazette's original design was to protect the interests of the domestic bourgeoisie. Because only these 0.6% of people in the country have the right to vote and be elected, the interests of the bourgeoisie can be protected to the greatest extent. Some moderates previously proposed lowering the conditions for property elections to 100 francs, but this was met with strong opposition from the top and ignored by the people at the bottom. The higher ups don't want to share the power, so even if the lower level lowers their qualifications to 10 francs, it doesn't matter to them. However, in this difficult time, people recalled this law, and the result was a demand for the abolition of property suffrage and the introduction of universal suffrage. At the same time, the banquet movement became more and more intense, but Louis Philippe was not in the mood to care about the clowns in his heart. At this time, Louis Philippe found an excellent opportunity for the Bourbons to regain dominance in the Apennines. Italy, the Bourbon Parma family returned to Parma, and at this time the Bourbon family in the Two Sicilies was deeply troubled by the uprising. If France sends troops at this time, can it create an axis on the Apennines? Louis Philippe felt at this time, the French people would be moved by his ambitious hegemony. Although the situation in Spain is very bad, the good news is that the British can't afford it, so France has not lost. In Louis Philippe's plan, France, Spain, Italy, plus Algeria, Tunisia, and Egypt in West Africa, he will be able to turn the Mediterranean into France's inland sea, and by then he will have completed the great cause of surpassing the Sun King. However, on February 1st, 1848, rebels surrounded the city of Naples. On February 10th, Ferdinand II announced his acceptance of the constitution. When the news reached France, the whole country was shocked. Louis Philippe couldn't believe his ears. The kingdom of the Two Sicilies with 100,000 troops was defeated like this. He immediately ordered Baron Pasquia to ban banquets in the country to prevent the tragedy of the kingdom of the Two Sicilies from happening again. Opposition lawmaker Lamartine immediately rushed to the parliamentary podium. After learning of the incident, "Gentlemen, the king and his thugs want to silence us with the help of the police. Do you remember the tennis court declaration? The king closes the meeting place, but the holy place in our hearts will not close." Liberal leader Odilon Barrot added fuel to the fire, saying with a heavy heart, 18 years have passed since the July Revolution, and I'm compelled today, February 14th, 1848, to oppose the government established in this great revolution and to defend the dignity that we had achieved even under the tyrant Charles X. This incident directly connected it with the French Revolution. and the memory of the dead Parisians came back to life. Another storm is coming, but this February is not just for the French. At the same time, due to the great development of railways, the speed of news dissemination at this time was much higher than the same period in history. When the news that the king of the Two Sicilies admitted defeat reached Germany, the three southern German countries of Baden, Württemberg, and Bavaria were the first to go up in flames, followed by Saxony, Hesse, and Prussia. Baden fell first. The citizens of Kaiserslautern, the capital, directly surrounded the palace. The army refused to fire on the people. The Grand Duke of Baden had to make concessions, dismissed his prime minister, appointed a liberal cabinet, and accepted the constitution. Almost at the same time, the Grand Duke of Württemberg also announced his acceptance of the constitution and immediately abdicated. In Bavaria, Ludwig I was unmoved in the face of overwhelming petitions. He felt that Bavaria was one of the four major powers and he should not be threatened by the untouchables. Ludwig I not only rejected the petition, but even dismissed him, a minister who advocated compromise with the people. However, what he did not expect was that the people of Munich took direct action. They used a grand parade to attack the weapons stores along the street and took control of the weapons depot before the city defense forces could react. Then the angry people began to retaliate wildly. They attacked the residences of officials everywhere. In particular, Interior Secretary Burks and Chief of the Interior Hunter Berg received special attention. Interior Minister Burks and Chamberlain Hunter Berg were well-known corrupt officials in Bavaria at the time, and it was believed that they had seduced the king. People also attacked Lallemonts's mansion on the outskirts of the city, but they did not catch this beautiful woman who brought disaster to the country and the people. Ludwig I's favorite lover was almost attacked, and he also wanted to imitate Lubu, who was so angry that he immediately mobilized an army to enter Munich. However, due to a series of changes in historical outcomes, the power of German nationalism at this time is countless times stronger than at the same time in history. The insurgents in Munich jumped out of the barricades and exchanged signals with the army. When the officer was confused, he had become a prisoner of the nationalists in the blink of an eye. King Kin's 50,000 strong army joined the force to force the palace into the palace. The Bavarians shouted slogans such as "Kill the slut" and "Drive away the gangster king." Soon, uprisings broke out in various parts of Bavaria. Seeing that the situation was over, Ludwig I announced his abdication and let his eldest son succeed to the throne in an attempt to save the rule of the Wurtzbach family. People at that time were generally relatively simple, and most people still believed that the king was a good king, but he was deceived by bad people. Interior Secretary Burks and Chief of the Interior Hunter Berg were sentenced to death, but Lallemonts, the culprit, escaped the sanction of the law and the people. When the angry people rushed into the secret manor mentioned by Ludwig I, she had already fled, and no one knew the whereabouts of this enchantress. Chapter 845 Demonic Wind. The huge Bavaria only lasted 5 days. This was all due to the developed railway lines in the German region. At this time, the total length of railways in the German region had exceeded 7,000 kilometers, while at the same time in history, it was only 3,500 kilometers. By the way, at this time, the total length of railways in Britain and the United States had exceeded 10,000 kilometers. And Austria ranked third with 8,000 kilometers. Louis Philippe's ambitions have not been realized. At this time, the total length of French railways was only 2,100 kilometers, which was slightly stronger than the 1,900 kilometers at the same time in history. Seeing Bavaria fall, other German princes became even more frightened, and at the same time, this greatly strengthened the confidence of the nationalists. In panic, princes from all walks of life wrote letters to Austria and Prussia asking for help. However, Prussia at this time was also suffering from nationalism. Various factions were under the banner of nationalism. Historically, the Zoo rally had only more than 20,000 people, but at this time, nearly 100,000 people participated, accounting for nearly 1/3 of the entire Berlin population. However, the Prussian army was still very fierce. They opened fire on the assembled people regardless of their numerical disadvantage. As a result, an army of more than 2,000 people was besieged by 50 times the number of people. In the end, General Leopold von Gerlach King William IV stayed the Khan, and his immediate troops were all killed, and for a time the streets were filled with the corpses of Prussian soldiers. However, the people did not choose to storm the palace, so the Prussian royal guard breathed a sigh of relief. However, what was even more chaotic than Berlin was the Rhine region. When this storm swept across the Rhine region, the Archbishop of Cologne directly announced that the Rhine region would gain autonomy. Marshal Karl von Hagen, the commander-in-chief of the Rhine region, wanted to send troops to suppress the attack, but was placed under house arrest by the German nationalist officers around him. Most of the senior officials in the Rhine region were nationalists who had infiltrated the Prussian government's Hydra, and they were about to tear the entire Prussia in half. All this happened within a dozen days, which was somewhat unacceptable to Frederick William IV. If he bows his head now, Prussia will inevitably become a duelist country, but if he doesn't bow his head, he may lose his head like Louis XVI. Finally, William IV decided to write a letter to Austria asking for help. At this time, Austria was relatively calm and there were no rebellions or forced palace incidents. However, a large number of German nationalists poured into Bohemia, and both sides turned the streets into battlefields. Several demonstrations broke out in Vienna, with German nationalists demanding the expulsion of the Czechs to join the Russians east of the Carpathians. However, due to the strong internal inspection system, these small-scale riots quickly subsided, and citizens became relatively law-abiding. The mainstream media has long been controlled by Franz, and some tabloids that like to spread random news have been dealt with in a timely manner. Overall, there are no major problems with public opinion. In fact, there is another reason, and that is that the student party, which is the most difficult to deal with, has not yet started school. Franz's plan was to delay the opening of school, which immediately aroused enthusiastic responses from the majority of school scum. All those who came to the school in advance were sent back to their place of origin, and those who stayed in the name of scientific research had to take an exam. Those who passed the test were sent to Tyrol to continue scientific research, and those who failed were directly repatriated. Under this operation, the combat effectiveness of the rebels suddenly dropped by 2 orders of magnitude. College students in the 19th century were too precious, and Franz couldn't bear the pain of murdering them. However, young people were easily affected by some emotions and thoughts after all, so he had no choice but to take this approach. The northern Italy region also looks very peaceful under the suppression of strong military forces. At the same time, the huge fines have also made those local tycoons afraid. The poor will probably go to the colonies to pay off their debts, but the rich squires will have their families ruined. Alpacino Corleone and his gang, as well as fellow outsiders, exacted massive revenge on the local bullies who had bullied them in northern Italy. A large number of scandals were exposed, and the news was widely spread in the taverns. The people did not want to be fools and let the gentlemen pick the peaches with their own blood and tears. As for the nationalists and the Jesuits under Pius IX, there were more scandals. Many of the former were wanted, while the latter were typical examples of the unkindness and hypocrisy of wealth. In fact, not only the media in Vienna, but also most newspapers in northern Italy had business dealings with Franz, and were even directly controlled by him. Therefore, only things that should appear in the newspaper will appear, and some things that should not appear will not appear. This is a unilateral massacre of the rebels by the Austrian government, and there is no counterattack. Except for some chaos in Bohemia, normal order is basically maintained in other areas, and the country's operations are relatively normal. Metternich was considering sending troops to the German region, but he quickly rejected it, because God knew whether Austria would encounter the same trouble. While Franz was recruiting troops in Tyrol, he was also collecting intelligence at home and abroad. It seems that after these years of development, Austria will not be as precarious as it was in history. But it is a pity that the Hungarians did not move. Of course, the Hungarians are not stupid. They cannot act rashly without unrest in Austria. As for Italy, both Sardinia and the Pope are just clowns. Franz can guarantee that, if Carlo Alberto dares to act rashly at this time, at least 100,000 troops will invade Turin. However, it was a clown that Franz could not even look at that changed everything. February 16, 1848. Pius IX issued an edict denying entry to Austrians, and required the Austrian Empire to withdraw from the Papal States. This edict will be notified to all Western countries, So France, Britain, Prussia, Spain, the Kingdom of Sardinia, and the Ottoman Empire jointly issued a statement demanding that Austria return the territory of the Papal State. At the same time, Pius IX also authorized all citizens of the Papal States to raise their own armed forces and violently expel the Austrians for a time. Austria, which had been peaceful for a long time, was directly pushed to the forefront. After all, at this time, all countries in the world hoped to pass on domestic conflicts. This was an almost unsolvable situation. France thought about it for a long time. Austria had no way to escape unscathed, and had no choice but to abandon its car to protect its leader. Otherwise it would be the enemy of the whole world. But this retreat was too difficult for Metternich. All his efforts for the rest of his life were devoted to the land of the Papal States. He wanted to annex central Italy, to realize the old emperor's and his own dreams. Franz didn't care about the land of the Papal States, and Metternich was indeed a little too hasty. It would be fine if it was just 2 pieces of land on the border, but he would dig into everyone's heart. It was strange that Pius IX had no reaction, but this kind of offending someone to death was indeed not something ordinary people could do. Based on the Pope's behavior and the corrupt officials under him, the land of the Papal States will belong to Austria sooner or later, and it is only a matter of time before it can be taken back. In fact, there is another reason why Franz doesn't care much about the land in the Papal States, and that is that the land here is too barren, and he has to spend money on it every year. However, what Franz was worried about was whether Pius IX would cause any more troubles in the future. At this time, he had already made up his mind to send the Pope to another world to harm others. Chapter 846 Calculation. This issue left the entire Austrian Empire with no time to think about anything else. The Regency Council studied it for a long time and even called Franz back from Tyrol overnight. But this time Franz had no choice but to take a step back. After all, he knew very well that the entire Western world would be in chaos soon, and he had a better plan to get back what he had lost all at once. Although Pius IX was the apparent leader of the Italian nation at this time, he was not as beloved as he imagined. And as a member of the old era, the Pope will sooner or later be liquidated by his supporters. Counting the days, France's February Revolution has been put on the agenda, and Count Chambord's mother is still calling for the return of Bourbon orthodoxy in Paris. The Count of Chambord himself has completely assumed the role of the Grand Duke of Fribourg. He is enjoying the happiness and responsibility of writing as a monarch. In less than half a year, Count Chambord had formulated hundreds of policies and revised almost all of Fribourg's laws. There is no doubt that for ordinary people, he was a good king who was diligent and caring for his people, but most of these policies and laws could not be implemented due to the limitations of the era at that time. It is a bad habit for a monarch of a big country to do everything personally, but for a small country with a mountain city, it does make the people feel very cordial. Although France was in turmoil at this time, and Count Chambord did have the intention to restore the glory of Bourbon, he did not feel that these small fights could shake the Orleans dynasty. In addition, although Louis Philippe publicized that Count Chambord had become a bastard of the Germans, the latter himself thought it was nothing. As an heir to the French throne, and also a Duke of the German Confederation, this is normal. In fact, the Orthodox faction doesn't care much about this. On the contrary, they are very glad that they will have the opportunity to expand their territory in the future. Since Pius IX started a people's war and all parties were urging him urgently, Franz had no good solution. When Metternich heard Franz say that he had no good solution and could only take a step back before talking, the old prime minister was actually a little relieved. After all, it is not a glorious thing to be reminded by juniors often. At this point Metternich could only announce that the Austrian Empire would withdraw from the territory of the Papal States. This is actually a strategic retrenchment in order to go further next time. It's just that the people don't understand it that way. They only know that the Austrian Empire has never suffered such a huge failure and humiliation in these years. Although Franz is also trying his best to control public opinion and narrow the scope of influence, the reality is that the influence and spread of this storm far exceed his imagination. This incident immediately caused an uproar in Vienna, which was relatively peaceful before. Before this, Metternich could only be regarded as notorious, but at this time he had become the #1 national thief. Demonstrations came one after another. This time, no nationalist instigation was needed. Vienna's grassroots officials, citizens, businessmen, as well as Germans who worked, traveled, and visited relatives in Vienna all spontaneously joined in. A gathering of 100,000 people at the zoo was scary enough, but at this time, the number of people gathering in Vienna's Central Park could no longer be counted. Legend has it that on February 18, 1848, half of the residents of Vienna went to Central Park to denounce the traitor Metternich and the witness of those ancient sages. Vienna Central Park is later known as the Vienna Central Cemetery, where Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, Schubert, Strauss and his sons, as well as many celebrities and sages are buried here. At this time, the Austrian Empire's control was far stronger than at the same time in history, but it still seemed small in the face of such huge waves. Archduke Albrecht was ordered to lead troops to disperse illegally gathered crowds, which really made people sweat. Fortunately, his status as a war hero was still sought after, and he did not follow the example of General Leopold von Gerlach. There was no violent conflict like in history. In fact, Albrecht chose a smarter and more euphemistic approach, which was to explain the reason for dispersing the crowd as preventing another cholera epidemic. Although the disease cholera did not spread on a large scale in Austria, and did not cause too many casualties, it was only compared to other countries. As the #1 plague in the 19th century, it was not a problem to take away 1,800 lives. Furthermore, even if people have never eaten pork, they have always seen pigs running away. France and Russia next door were severely affected, and the German and Italian regions were equally serious. Even the British Empire was not immune to the disaster at this time. Because of this, the dissuasive effect of cholera is still very obvious. Neither ordinary people nor die-hard nationalists have much objection to this expulsion operation. But Franz saw one thing. At this time, Prince Metternich had lost his mind, and Count Karlarov did not seem to care about what was happening in front of him. In fact, the latter also felt that Prince Metternich had lost his mind, but he also felt that this was a good opportunity to bring down Metternich, and he felt that he would do better after becoming prime minister in Count Korolov's eyes. Metternich was a fool and would be entangled in the Italian issue. If it were him, he would develop towards South Germany and at least get rid of the Czechs in Bohemia. The call for a constitution in Austria is not that high. This is mainly due to Joseph II. First of all, Austria's legal code is very complete, and most things can be done in accordance with the law. Secondly, the last time the emperor declared that he wanted to rule the country according to law, he directly set the entire country back decades. Moreover, the domestic conflicts in the Latania region were not acute, so the need for a constitution was not that urgent. Count Karlarov really wanted Austria to embrace Germany. He felt that he could take advantage of the chaos in the 3 South German countries to infiltrate them, and in turn use nationalism to hold a referendum. If the timing is right, it is not impossible to include North Germany. By the way, compared with his grand plan, Metternich's plan was too petty. Franz had no intention of understanding the overt and covert fights between the two life-seeking ministers, but it was a very unwise choice for them to involve Albrecht in this political turmoil. The actions of Prince Metternich and Count Korolov almost killed the last famous general of the Austrian Empire. They did not consider what would happen if the people really rebelled, if Albrecht had not been a hero in the war, and had not adopted a roundabout strategy. The result would most likely be the same as in history. No matter how restrained the Archduke himself was, he would not be able to stop some irrational people from directly attacking the military formation. Historically, Albrecht ordered the shooting only after he was pulled down by the marching crowd. The result was that the massacre of civilians became a stain on his life. And this kind of stain is extremely difficult to wash away. Even if you win more victories, you will only remember the title of executioner. Chapter 847 Reasonable, Unexpected. The most critical thing is that it will push the people to oppose the royal family. The smartest thing in the history of the Habsburg family is to create a beautiful image in the hearts of the people. So, even though the Austrian Empire has long since disappeared, there are still many people who miss the rule of the Habsburg family. At this time, Metternich's order to expel the assembly was completely unintentional. No one would be afraid of him, but it would make him the target of public criticism. However, Metternich made this decision as a human being. After all, he had been a powerful minister for decades, so how could he be afraid of ordinary people and nationalists who were manipulated by him in every possible way? According to Metternich's own words, "I have fought against the greatest soldiers, I have brought emperors, kings, czars, and sultans, principalities and republics to compromise. 20 times I have entangled and untied the threads of palace rebellion. In fact, this is an approach that is in line with the power of minister. In this special country, Metternich is more like an emperor than Ferdinand I." But what Metternich didn't know was that this time he was not facing college students who only cried when they were arrested and carbonary people who reported on each other, but a group of existences that would make the whole of Europe tremble. The karma accumulated over the years always requires a scapegoat, and Prince Metternich is undoubtedly the most suitable person. But Franz still hopes that the old prime minister can have a more decent ending, and escaping in women's clothing is still a bit too embarrassing. February 17, 1848. The new venue for the banquet event announced by Paris National Journal, the Élysée Palace. The Élysée Palace was built in 1718. In 1815, after Napoleon I was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo, he signed a letter of surrender and abdicated here. The Élysée Palace is located at the east end of the Champs-Élysées in Paris, covering an area of 11,000 square meters. It is located in the bustling city center, and there is a large garden of more than 20,000 square meters behind it, which can just meet the needs of banquet events. But differences soon arose within the reformists, and Odilon Barrot directly chose to betray. He directly doubled the threshold fee for participating in the banquet, and withdrew most of the free tickets. Of course, some people said that he was taking advantage of the opportunity to make profits, but in any case, Odilon Barrot's behavior was to limit the number of people attending the banquet. Later, the location and time of the banquet were also changed. The location was changed from the Élysée Palace in the city center to the remote western suburbs of Paris. The time was changed from Sunday to Tuesday, and the original 20th was also changed to the 22nd. Odilon Barrot promised the government to do everything possible not to disrupt the order, and agreed to the intervention of the gendarmes at the banquet, and the use of force, if necessary. Louis Philippe was very satisfied with the result. He felt that everything was under his control. As long as he got through this difficulty, he would be able to realize his grand ambitions. After all, the Axis was about to be formed. However, if nothing unexpected happens at this time, something unexpected will happen. First, Odilon Barrot, the leader of the reformists, received a series of bad news from the German region. This made him feel very scared. He was more afraid of revolution than the failure of reform. In the end, Odilon Barrot decided to withdraw from the banquet, but once Pandora's box was opened, he couldn't help it. As Marist said, "Are you afraid of civil war? If you join, you have a chance to prevent civil war. If you refuse, it will cause civil war. The more you avoid it, the heavier the sin will be upon you." In fact, there were also differences within the Republicans at this time. Some people felt that they should strike while the iron was hot and launch an armed uprising, while others felt that they should wait for the opportunity. However, the Republicans were only a minority at this time, and the mainstream of the reformists were still the Orleansides and the Orthodox. Louis Philippe finally breathed a sigh of relief when he learned that Odilon Barrot had decided to withdraw from the banquet. It's stable this time. February 22, 1848, the clouds turned sunny, so it was not suitable to travel, and it was suitable to kill people. The gloomy sky and light rain in the morning still couldn't stop people's curiosity. A large number of idle people, women, and children followed the people attending the banquet through the streets and alleys. Everything at first was as sleep-inducingly boring as Odilon Barrot had promised. However, at 11 noon, the sky suddenly cleared and someone climbed up the marble statue in front of the Pantheon. "Citizens, our cabinet has been betraying our French honor and interests. They have sold us to the English, the Austrians, the Prussians, the Spaniards. The Turkish-Egyptian war ceded all our rights in Egypt. We endured it. During the Luxembourg crisis, the Austrians betrayed their trust and launched a shameless sneak attack on us. We endured it. In the Alsace-Lorraine crisis, the Prussians and the Austrians trampled on our land, massacred our people, and forced our compatriots to learn their disgusting language and evil religion. We endure it again. Now the ridiculous King Yali actually wants to use our French money and French lives to please his bitch mistress, the Queen Regent Christiana of Spain. Can we bear it? Exclamation mark. The audience shouted no. Very well. Citizens. Marseillaise, go forward, sons and daughters of the motherland. Rise up quickly, a glorious day awaits you. Then a team of 700 college students as the vanguard, singing La Marseillaise, set off from the Pantheon, crossed the Seine River, arrived at the Place de la Concorde, passed the 7th District Bridge, and went straight to the Palais Bourbon, the seat of the House of Representatives as the only designated war song in France. La Marseillaise has a special place in the hearts of the French. The team continues to grow on the road, and the people gather together like streams flowing into the sea. The guards on the bridge tried to stop the march, but the people singing La Marseillaise ignored them, and people finally passed the bridge smoothly. The National Guards who were responsible for guarding the House of Representatives in front of the Palais Bourbon showed great restraint, and tried their best to dissuade the people from using violence. In fact, they did not want to repeat the mistakes of the French Revolution, and the same was true for the dragoons who were later ordered to rush to the door of the House of Representatives. To maintain order the momentum comes, but the result is only momentum. The first order of the dragoon officer is to sheath the sword. This operation is naturally not a deterrent. Seeing this scene, the people couldn't help but shout long live France. Facing the coming catastrophe, Louis Philippe did not feel much nervousness. In fact, when he heard that there was no bloodshed, he even laughed out loud. As expected, they were just showing off. In fact, the reason why Louis Philippe had this illusion was largely due to the commander of the Paris garrison, General Sebastian Point. In order to show his ability, this arrogant and foolish general did not tell Louis Philippe the truth. In the eyes of General Sebastian, the people of Paris are just a mob, especially their so-called leaders who chose to surrender before the war started. They are really a bunch of ridiculously weak guys. At the same time, history did not let Metternich go. The day after Austria announced its withdrawal from the Papal States, Pius IX spoke again, demanding that the Austrian Empire withdraw from Italy. Chapter 848 The Belgrade Conspiracy. As soon as this news broke out, Europe was in an uproar, and Italian nationalists knew that their spring had arrived. Riots broke out in Lombardy and Venetia one after another, and even Tuscany, Lucca, and Modena in the hands of the Habsburg family were not spared. People shouted long live Pius IX, long live the unification of Italy, long live constitutional freedom, and ignited beacon fires in Italy. However, most of these beacon fires started in the cities, rather than in the more pious and ignorant rural areas. Such riots made Carlo Alberto extremely frightened. What he wanted was an Italy ruled by the Kingdom of Sardinia, not an Italy controlled by the magic stick. Carlo Alberto ordered Count di Castignito, who was in charge of intelligence work, to use all available resources to pay close attention to the movements in Vienna. At the same time, he contacted the rebels in Lombardy and Venetia, and promised them high officials and generous salaries. He wanted to get there first. After all, Pius IX was only the Pope, and not the King. Only the Savoy family could unify Italy. At this time, the 38-year-old Cavour almost jumped up when he heard the news. He felt that the opportunity for the Kingdom of Sardinia had come, and immediately published an article in his Revenge stating, only the Kingdom of Sardinia can unite Italy, and the king should accept the constitution. Cavour was a nobleman and a capitalist, so he supported the expansion of the unification war, and wanted to put shackles on the king. There was no conflict between these 2 points. As for so-called nationalism and Mazzini's ideas, he scorned them all. After learning the news, Britain publicly expressed its support for the Italian Risorgimento, and at the same time immediately issued a letter of credence urging Austria to return northern Italy to the Italians as soon as possible. The Italians in the British credentials are worth pondering. They support the emergence of another great power or quasi-great power in Italy. After all, this is a much better result than France or Austria completely controlling Italy. In short, the more countries on the European continent and the more dispersed the power, the more in line with the interests of the British and the new Italy could only rely on Britain. At least John Russell thought so. However, Palmerston did not think so. He felt that Italy would be a heavy burden. It would be better to only let northern Italy become independent instead of reviving the so-called Italy, so that a true balance can be achieved. As the younger brother of the British, the Ottoman Empire naturally chose to follow up directly. But I don't know if anyone cares about Majid's credentials. In fact, the trade volume between Austria and the Ottoman Empire has increased year by year in recent years, and in terms of profit alone, it has exceeded the trade with the British. Therefore, Majid's decision immediately aroused dissatisfaction among domestic business groups. They could not accept the Sudan's stupid decision, let alone lose such a good business partner in Austria. But Majid actually had deeper considerations, because Serbian Grand Duke Milo Sobranović came not long ago and made a bold suggestion to him. Great Sudan, we can take this opportunity to take back Western Bosnia, Montenegro, Albania, and even go further to take back Belgrade. As soon as these words came out, Majid's interest was immediately aroused. Pius IX could take back northern Italy, so why couldn't the Ottoman Empire take back those homelands? In fact, Western Bosnia, Montenegro, and northern Albania are not very attractive to Majid, but Belgrade is an important land and water transportation route point. As long as it controls this place, it is equivalent to controlling the gate of the Balkans. At that time, the Ottoman Empire will be able to regain control of the Danube River basin. Serbia, Wallachia, and Moldavia would all be more closely linked to the Ottoman Empire as a result. Note, at this time, Serbia, Wallachia, and Moldavia were all nominal vassals of the Ottoman Empire, and Wallachia and Moldavia were Russian protectorates at the same time. You can also choose to go north, to capture Vienna to fulfill the glory and dream of the Ottoman Empire. As for Miloš's statement that he would defend the country for the Ottoman Empire, neither of them would take it seriously. Miloš wanted to retake Belgrade with the help of the Ottoman Empire, while Majid wanted to take the opportunity to regain control of the Danube River basin. However, they have a common enemy, and that is Austria, which is also the basis for cooperation between the two parties. Miloš is a local snake who is very familiar with those lands, and he also has internal contacts in Austria. There is no doubt that Sultan Majid is a dragon who has crossed the river. He relies on the Ottoman Empire's strong military and economic strength, as well as the great cause of regaining his homeland. The Russian ambassador was shocked and angry about this incident, but he could only choose to ask His Majesty the Tsar for instructions, because the matter was too big for him to make the decision at all. Things developed too fast, and Russia's disadvantage in being in a remote place was infinitely magnified. In fact, that's not entirely true, because the water was too muddy, and Nicholas I wanted to see it first, before talking. Prussia and Spain were both in a precarious situation at this time, but they had their own different judgments and approaches. Spain was deep in civil war, and they wanted to divert the conflict, so they decided to make trouble for Austria. Moreover, the Spaniards do not believe that the two sides can really fight. This kind of thing will most likely end in nothing. After all, no country will really go to war for the Pope. Prussia was in chaos, and William IV's Sword found it difficult to even think of Berlin. He also believed that the two sides would not really fight. The reason why the Pope succeeded last time was because the Austrians violated the agreement first and went deep into the Pope to develop their power, but this time the conditions proposed by Pius IX were too harsh, extremely provocative, and trampled on the dignity of the Austrian power. If it were before the 19th century, I'm afraid that the Holy City would have been bloodbathed and the Pope would have been replaced. However, with the wave of nationalism and revolution sweeping across Europe, this matter should eventually come to an end. Although the Austrians have nothing to do against the Papal State for the time being, they have many tricks they can use against Prussia, which also belongs to the German Confederation. For example, with the current wave of nationalism, as long as Prussia is labeled a traitor, those fanatical nationalists will most likely actually rise up in rebellion. Even without engaging in a people's war. William IV could not afford to expel the Hohenzollern family from German citizenship. In fact, the German nationalists at this time had occupied the Confederation Assembly in Frankfurt, and they were even preparing to turn the Confederation into an empire. Yes, it would also be possible to establish the First German Reich or directly rebuild the Holy Roman Empire. Anyway, Germany should be unified under the same flag. The French would love to see the Austrians expelled from Italy, but they have more important things to deal with at the moment. The rally on February 22, 1848 soon turned into a demonstration, something Louis Philippe was not prepared to see. Chapter 849 An Unimagined Road. Louis Philippe had 3 generals under his command: Lézard, the Paris police chief; General Sebastian, the commander of the Paris garrison; and Jacqueminot, the commander-in-chief of the National Guard. The total force in their hands was as high as 60,000. It was precisely because of such a powerful force that Louis Philippe felt that everything was under his control. Of course, General Sebastian also had the credit for lying about the military situation. In fact, this is also due to Police Chief Russell. He has the smallest number of troops, but they are all elite. At that time, the Paris police were the most elite force in Paris. These people were selected from experienced and physically strong soldiers. They have the best equipment, the best training, and the most generous treatment in France, so they are extremely loyal and disciplined. It was precisely because of this that Lézard wanted to take all the credit. He ignored General Sebastian's garrison and chose to directly send cavalry to disperse the crowd. That's right. At that time, the police in Paris had a cavalry system, and as the defenders of the dynastic order and those who performed police functions, they would inevitably have some conflicts with ordinary people. This long-term and protracted conflicts created hatred between the two sides, so some Paris police officers gave them a few harsh blows. While performing their official duties, someone had several bones broken by the Paris police. And some unlucky people fell down during the pushing and were trampled to death. This may not be a big deal in normal times, but at this time the anger of the people of Paris has been ignited. Moreover, those college students and nationalists will not be arbitrarily manipulated by the Paris police like ordinary people. Paris police killed someone. The Paris police have long been used to this kind of talk, but today it was an order from the superintendent, with the king's backing, so they became even more ruthless. As an old district of Paris, people have a strong sense of resistance, and with nationalists and student parties taking the lead, the conflict soon turned into armed fighting. The first shot of gunfire declared that the conflict was out of control. When General Sebastian and his Paris garrison arrived, they faced heavily armed people and barricades everywhere. In order to obtain weapons, people began to attack weapons stores and lone military policemen. The result was that the scale of chaos became increasingly uncontrollable. Faced with such a chaotic situation, both Lézard and General Sebastian had no idea. They wanted to ask the old Marshal Soult to come out. However, the old Prime Minister, who was about to retire in a few months, chose to resign at the speed of light. He did not want to be involved in the whirlpool of the French Revolution again. After all, the paper could not cover the fire, and Baron Pasquier reported to Louis Philippe everything that happened in the outside world. However, the former still chose to distort the facts in favor of his colleagues, which shocked the latter, but Louis Philippe felt that he still had a trump card, which was the National Guard. The National Guard was actually a bourgeois army composed of taxpayers. Louis Philippe felt that he was one with the Orleans bourgeoisie and shared weal and woe. The National Guard had a total strength of over 35,000 men and was commanded by Jacques Minaud, one of Louis Philippe's most trusted ministers. However, doing business at a loss is not something that businessmen would do. Almost all the National Guards turned a deaf ear to Jacques Minaud's orders. In the end, Jacques Minaud only summoned less than 1,000 people. These people were a drop in the bucket for the current situation in Paris, and soon these people also shouted "Long live reform" and joined the other side's camp. Nothing could be worse than the Prime Minister resigning, deserting, the army mutinying, and if anything, it must be the situation in Paris at this time. After Jacques Minaud became the polished commander, he immediately took his family on a cruise to the United States. Lézard and his police force were besieged by the Parisians. After a day of fierce fighting, the Paris police force surrendered. Lesser was lynched, and his body was dismembered into countless pieces, with only his head hanging in front of the Palais Bourbon point. While Lesser and his police force were under siege, General Sebastian and his garrison plunged into the barricades. This general obviously lacked actual combat experience and courage. After 30 hours of attacking, he still did not dismantle a single barricade point at this time. Louis Philippe could only choose to sacrifice his ministers. He first dismissed General Sebastian, the commander of the Paris garrison, but the Paris people were obviously not satisfied. After that, he dismissed more than a dozen ministers in succession, to satisfy the people's representatives. February 23, 1848, night point. The streets of Paris were decorated with lights and colorful decorations, as if to welcome the new year. Crowds waved tricolor flags and sang La Marseillaise through the streets of Paris. However, the Paris garrison and the personal bodyguards of those big shots did not relax their vigilance. Similar to the historical La Fontaine incident, a mysterious gunshot broke the happy atmosphere. When a parade passed near the mansion of a big shot atmosphere point, the guards who were frightened by the gunshots instinctively fired back at the crowd. Gunshots rang out one after another. In the end, dozens of people were killed or injured, and the sounds of wailing, crying, and cursing were heard. Point after the commotion subsided, people used the light of torches to see clearly the appearance of the deceased. Among them was a young woman with a good-looking face. She was shot twice. The clothes on her chest were torn open, and there was a bright red stain on the exposed large piece of white grout color. People's anger was ignited again, and people returned to the barricades again, and vowed to fight the Orleans dynasty to the end point. While Louis Philippe was trying to make greater concessions, he resurrected Thiers, who had been deposed because of the Turkish-Egyptian War, and Ottoline Barrett, who had shown favor to the dynasty. Point at this time, Barrow was still trying to persuade the people to abandon the war, but his reputation had been disgraced, and he had no appeal at this time. Point Thiers continued his usual tough style, and he immediately ordered Butcher Biraud to take charge of all military affairs in Paris. Thomas Robert Burgot de la Burgondy was the governor general mentioned earlier, who carried out a policy of massacre in Algeria. Point he was equally merciless towards the French. As soon as he took over, he immediately ordered the soldiers to bombard the barricades with cannons. 30 minutes later, Butcher Biraud used the most cruel and efficient method to conquer the barricades that General Sebastian had used 3 times before. A barricade that could not be conquered in 10 hours. However, at this time, Louis Philippe panicked. He was afraid that the tragedy would happen again, so he forced Bichus to treat the French citizens in a more reasonable and gentle way, and give the other party a chance to negotiate. Point this behavior of Louis Philippe directly shook the morale of the army, because the soldiers at the grassroots level clearly felt that the top brass had no determination. Point even a famous general could not lead a team that had lost military morale. So the Paris government troops began to retreat steadily. Point seeing that the situation was over, Thiers asked Louis Philippe to immediately withdraw from Paris and take refuge in Orleans to avoid repeating the mistakes of Louis XVI. He would mobilize large armies from other parts of France to quell the rebellion. Point however, at the critical moment, Louis Philippe once again backed down, and Ottoline Barrett also opposed his strategy. Point in desperation, Thiers could only take out the letter written by Franz, and fled to Alsace-Lorraine with Louis Philippe and his family. Chapter 850 An Unimagined Road. Louis Philippe wrote an edict of abdication before leaving. Today, my God-given Louis Philippe of Orleans surrenders my country and my throne to my grandson, the Count of Paris. May he fulfill the mission given to him by God. Louis Philippe obviously wanted to give up his job to keep his commander-in-chief, which was not uncommon in European courts. The King of Bavaria was also forced to abdicate before, and then passed the throne to his son, maintaining the rule of the Wurtzbach family. Point in fact, Louis Philippe had another consideration, that is, the Count of Paris was just 10 years old, and the Duchess of Orleans was a woman with no political experience. Point because of these two conditions, theoretically, if the Count of Paris succeeds to the throne, Louis Philippe will most likely continue to hide behind the scenes and control the country. Point the Duchess of Orleans rushed to the House of Representatives with her son as soon as she learned of Louis Philippe's abdication, but reality gave her a hard blow. Point first, the Parliament refused to recognize her power, and then Republican member Denoyle led a crowd to attack the Parliament. Point the Count of Paris was knocked down, and if the Duchess of Orleans had not protected her son with her body, the former would have been trampled to death. Afterwards, the Duchess took her eldest son and Prince Edward to embark on a great escape. The angry people failed to find the king and threw the king's throne in the square and burned it. Against the backdrop of the firelight, people sang Marseillaise again. At this time, the French Republicans had an absolute advantage, but the Reform and National factions were at odds. The former hopes to implement universal suffrage and reform the existing economic and political systems, while the latter hopes to implement trade protection policies, implement a real property election system, and expand the voice of the emerging industrial bourgeoisie. The property election system adopted by the Orleans dynasty actually still involved many nobles, and the king's power was too great. However, since the Paris uprising, the members of the House of Lords have become as evasive as the king. In addition to the Reform and National factions, there are actually Regency and Orthodox factions. Naturally, the regent was the Duchess of Orleans, who was unwilling to fail. She found Odilon Barrow, who was also unwilling to accept the defeat. The two parties hit it off and decided to continue the matter. The Orthodox faction is the faction headed by the Duchess of Berry, the mother of Count Chambord, who hoped to restore Bourbon orthodoxy. But with the promulgation of the Provisional Republican government, the efforts of the two duchesses failed. In order not to repeat the tragedy of Louis XVI, both the Duchess of Orleans and the Duchess of Berry quietly left Paris. The Orthodox king, Count Chambord, did not care too much about the situation in Paris. At this time, he just wanted to make Fribourg what he wanted. Louis Philippe had arrived in Alsace-Lorraine, and the local governor greeted His Majesty's arrival with a confused look on his face. However, Louis Philippe ordered the arrest of high-ranking officials in Alsace-Lorraine as soon as they met, and listed dozens of crimes against them. At the same time, he also ordered to exempt Alsace-Lorraine from taxes for 3 years. The effect was naturally immediate. Louis Philippe's reputation changed directly from a cruel and murderous tyrant to a deceived wise king. In fact, Louis Philippe has already prepared for the worst at this time. If necessary, he will go to the German Confederation Congress to ask for help like the old Calder did. That's right. When you are shameless enough, the French pretender to the throne can even claim to be the Duke of the German Confederation, and at the same time request the protection of the German countries from harm from France. Louis Philippe also had something to say. The Bourbons can be orthodox, but my Orleans family can't. By this time another pretender to the throne had returned to Paris, and Louis Napoleon Bonaparte was still an unknown figure. No one thought that this fugitive who had just escaped from prison would do anything, but he knew very well that it was time to act. At the same time, a little man returned to Lyon. To be honest, people here are still more afraid of soldiers. After all, the two bloody massacres are still fresh in people's memories, but when people saw the officer's appearance clearly, they breathed a sigh of relief. It was Charles Dutchett, a child born and raised in this city. He brought back a lot of food, medicine, as well as clothing and fuel. Brother Charles, several children ran over crying. These were children from the slums, and could be considered relatives of Charles Dutchett. While he asked his adjutant to lead people to distribute supplies, he asked about the situation in the slums. Is everyone okay? It's not good at all. Heavy rain, floods, famine, plague, many people died, and a new group of gangsters arrived in Nanchang. Don't worry, leave it all to me. Brother Charles, are you still leaving? Sheil nodded, knowing that his mission was far from over. February 17, 1848. The day after news of the Pope's request for the Austrian Empire to withdraw from Italy reached Vienna, a demonstration of unprecedented scale broke out in Vienna. The reason for the march was not to respond to the call of Pius IX. In fact, on the contrary, people felt that the government should not make concessions to the Papal States. It was understandable that the previous concession was because of the invasion of the territory of the Papal States, but this time it was completely Pius IX's face-changing output. Although Metternich had not done anything, people had already identified him as the culprit of this incident. After all, without the previous concessions, there would be no further advancement at this time. In fact, people don't care what Metternich did. In Austria, Civilians, nobles, and businessmen have already had enough of this greedy and autocratic prime minister who likes to work. Bureaucrats and politicians also disliked Metternich because he was too fond of playing power. Scholars and artists alike disliked Metternich because his censorship affected their work. Nationalists suffered years of repression, again because of Metternich. Coupled with the natural and man-made disasters in recent years, people are in great need of an outlet. There is no doubt that Metternich is the most suitable target. At this time, it can even be said that Metternich united the opposition. Although overthrowing the imperial family might have been more effective, the Austrians were not actually ready to leave the imperial family. At this time, the proportion of republicans in Austria was very small, and there were only a few people such as Guschen Cass and Alexander Bach. Count Latter, the Minister of War, discovered the seriousness of the situation and immediately dispatched 3 regiments of troops to protect the Prime Minister's office. The Austrian imperial government was more dominant than in history, so the government did not force Metternich to resign immediately under pressure. Count Latter is a hardliner and a veteran of the anti-French war. He is extremely hateful. These 3 regiments were carefully selected by Count Latter, who felt that, as long as the government did not back down, the common people could not win. Count Latter was so confident in his choice that he was even prepared to go to the front line himself. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.